Introduction: the inflection point between believing and knowing. For centuries, humanity has lived fragmented by an invisible but seemingly insurmountable border, the abyss between faith and reason. On one side, science has stood as the guardian of solid evidence, demanding repeatable and tangible measurements. On the other, spirituality has guarded the realm of the invisible, appealing to blind trust. However, in the most intimate fabric of reality, where the laws of classical physics vanish to give way to quantum mechanics, this distinction begins to dissolve. This book is born from a bold premise. Faith is not an escape from logic, but rather the culmination of a rational faith. We are not speaking here of a dogmatic belief. We speak of a belief based on hope, but rather of a mathematical constant of the spirit. It is the inflection point where the statistical probability of something happening meets the vibratory frequency of internal certainty. When an individual reaches this state, belief ceases to be a longing to become solid evidence. It becomes a direct instruction to the quantum field that sustains our existence. The concept of the constant of rational faith proposes that there is a measure, a threshold of coherence between thought and emotion that acts as the definitive click in the architecture of reality. To understand it, we must stop seeing the observer. The observer is not a passive spectator of the universe. Modern physics suggests that the act of observing not only alters what is observed, but defines it. If matter is, in essence, condensed energy and information, then our consciousness is the software that shapes it. Overcoming the duality between science and religion is key. It does not require abandoning the scientific method, but expanding it to include the ontology of being. By understanding that the vacuum is not the absence of things, but an ocean of infinite possibilities, the zero-point field, rational faith becomes the navigation tool. It is the ability to sustain a mental image and emotional signature. This must be done with such stability that the universe has no choice but to collapse that probability wave into a particle of physical experience. In these pages, we will explore how to move from believing, a state of latent doubt, to knowing, a state of absolute certainty. This transition is not a fortuitous miracle. It is a mechanical and spiritual process that responds to universal laws as precise as gravity. At the end of this journey, the reader will not only understand the structure of their reality, but will recognize their role as the conscious bridge that converts the invisible into matter. Welcome to the place where the equation is complete. Chapter 1. The Geometry of the Invisible. The world for most people is a collection of intransigent solids. A table is a table because it stops the hand's progress. A wall is a wall because it prohibits the body's passage. Humanity has built its sanity upon the tyranny of three dimensions: up and down, left and right, forward and back. We blindly trust the orthogonality of our rooms. We trust the straightness of our streets. But Elias knew that this trust was, at best, a comforting illusion, and at worst, a carefully designed trap. Elias was not a man given to unfounded paranoia. He was, or had been, a topologist of some renown at the University of San Severo, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to studying spaces. He studied properties of spaces preserved under continuous deformations. To him, a coffee cup and a donut were mathematically indistinguishable, both forms harboring a single whole, sharing a topological soul. However, his fascination did not stop at the academic curiosities of Euclidean surfaces. His mind had begun to drift toward unseen spaces. His mind drifted inexorably toward the spaces we could not see, but which mathematics demanded must exist. The city of Vesperia, where he resided, was the perfect breeding ground for his obsessions. It was an ancient metropolis, a leviathan of stone and steel, where glass skyscrapers cut the grey sky and Victorian alleys twisted like roots. To the naked eye, Vesperia was ordinary urban chaos. But for 6 months, Elias had begun to notice the errors. The first error he found was at the intersection of Martyrs Avenue and Clock Street. It was a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining with a melancholy persistence that varnished the cobblestones. Elias waited for the light to change. His gaze stopped at the corner of the Caron building, a brutalist structure of reinforced concrete. According to human perspective, the two walls converged at a perfect 90-degree angle. But the shadow projected by the building under the flickering light of the street lamps did not obey that geometry. The shadow bifurcated, suggesting a wall. It suggested the existence of a third invisible wall, a vertex extending toward a direction that was neither up nor down nor to the sides. It extended inward into reality. That day, Elias thought it was an optical trick, an aberration caused by the rain and refracted light. But his mind, trained in the rigor of higher dimensional equations, in and dimensions, he could not let go of the anomaly. He began carrying a black leather notebook, noting angles, measuring shadows, calculating the deviation between built architecture and the architecture that light, in its corpuscular and wave-like nature, seemed to reveal. The conclusion he reached was written on page 42 of his diary. With trembling calligraphy, it was the preamble to his descent into madness or perhaps enlightenment. The city is a projection. We live in the three-dimensional shadow of a hyperspatial structure. The true confirmation, the irrefutable proof that transformed his hypothesis into a terrifying certainty, came a month after the observation. The legacy of Valerius. He had been summoned to the basements of the university's central library to appraise a collection of documents donated by the widow of an obscure 19th-century mathematician, a man named Emmanuel Valerius. The basement smelled of old paper, dust, and the damp breath of forgotten history. Elias worked under the yellowish light of a desk lamp. He was surrounded by rickety cardboard boxes. Valerius had been a pariah in his time, expelled from European scientific societies for his theories on spiritual dimensions. His contemporaries branded him a mystic and a charlatan. Elias opened a folio tied with hemp twine. Inside, he found dozens of charcoal sketches of strange things. At first, they looked like absurd architectural drawings, Penrose stairs, intertwined Mobius strips, polyhedra with an impossible number of faces that seemed to fold over themselves in continuous visual paradoxes. They were beautiful, but lacked practical sense in a physical universe. However, reaching the bottom, his fingers touched something. It was not paper, but a plate of cold, dark, and surprisingly heavy metal. It was the size of a small book. Elias brought it into the light. The surface of the metal was engraved with an intricate network of geometric lines. It was not a static drawing. As Elias moved his head, altering the angle of vision and the incidence of light, they shifted. The lines seemed to reconfigure. Where he previously saw a simple cube, tilting the plate revealed a tesseract, a four-dimensional hypercube projected onto the metallic surface. But it went beyond a simple hologram or optical illusion. As he ran his fingertips over the surface, Elias felt indentations that changed position in the metal. His touch registered one shape, while his eyes registered another. On the back of the plate, engraved with a precise punch, were three phrases in rustic Latin: Visibilia sunt umbrae, visible things are shadows. Anguli celant ostia, angles hide doors. Punctum et initium e fini, the point is the beginning and the end. Accompanying the plate was a small diary bound in black velvet. Elias opened it with almost religious reverence. The pages were full of equations and diagrams. Valerius was not a mystic. He was a geometer who had been born a century before the world had the mathematical vocabulary to understand him. Valerius discovered the truth. He discovered that geometry did not just describe space, but, if truly understood, could manipulate it. According to the diary, our three-dimensional universe is like the surface of a pond. We are two-dimensional creatures, skating on the surface tension of the water, ignorant of the unfathomable depths below and the vast sky above. Valerius argued that there are fold points in our reality, places where the three-dimensional membrane of our universe curves and brushes against a volume of higher dimension, the hyperspace he called the pleroma. And most disturbing of all, Valerius claimed that these fold points were not natural. They had been built by something. The dissection of space. During the following weeks, Elias abandoned his classes. He locked himself in his small apartment, a fourth-floor studio overlooking an industrial alley, and transformed the walls into a canvas of madness. He photocopied Valerius's diary, enlarged the diagrams of the metal plate, and joined them with red thread to photographs of Vesperia. He began to understand the pattern. The geometry of the invisible was not a mathematical abstraction, it was an infrastructure. Valerius postulated the existence of a fundamental figure he called the transition heptahedron. In our dimension, perfect regular heptahedra do not exist. But you could project a superior polyhedron here. If projected into our space at a specific hyperspatial angle, its volumetric shadow would manifest as a space where Euclidean rules collapse. Elias began applying the formulas from the diary to the cartography of Vesperia. He discovered that the errors he had noticed, the shadow of the Charon building, were not isolated incidents. The abnormal echo under the Lethe River Bridge, the unexplained vertigo in the Plaza of the Forgotten, they were the vertices of an immense geometric figure superimposed over the city's geography. Someone, or something, had used Vesperia's architecture as scaffolding to build a hyperspatial machine, a city-sized topological lock. But for what purpose, Elias wondered, rubbing his bloodshot eyes while drinking his umpteenth cup of black coffee. Dawn filtered through the blinds, painting grey stripes over the scattered papers. What is on the other side of the geometry? Valerius's diary became cryptic in its final pages. Pure equations gave way to feverish descriptions. Valerius spoke of the blind architects, entities inhabiting the pleroma that perceived our world as we perceive a drawing on a sheet of paper, in its totality, all at once, without temporal limitations of before and after, or spatial limitations of inside and outside. For them, a closed human body was like an open circle on a page. They could reach our internal organs without breaking the skin, just as we can touch the center of a drawn circle without crossing its perimeter. Terror gripped Elias for the first time. If three-dimensional space was not an absolute barrier, then there was nowhere to hide. His apartment walls were just imaginary lines drawn in the air. They were lines for a fourth-dimensional creature. He had to see the fold for himself, not in shadows, not in equations, but in reality. He needed to find the epicenter, the point of convergence, where the invisible geometry exerted the greatest pressure on the fabric of the visible world. He needed to find the master vertex of the city, the main vertex. The calculations, verified 3 times feverishly on a chalkboard full of white chalk, led him to the city's historical heart, the central underground subway station, abandoned at the turn of the century due to severe water leaks and unspecified structural failures. Elias prepared his equipment driven by cold, analytical adrenaline. He packed a high-powered flashlight, a camera with film sensitive to a broad spectrum of light, Valerius's diary, and the metal plate, which curiously seemed to emit a very slight heat against the bottom of the bag. It was midnight on a Friday. Vesperia's streets were nearly deserted in the old district. The air had an unusual thickness. It was as if it were charged with static electricity, a dull omen of a storm. Elias forced the rusted lock of the gate leading to the station stairs. The descent into darkness was like entering the throat of a concrete beast. His steps echoed with a strange sound, a noise that seemed to reach his ears a fraction of a second early. It reached him before his foot actually touched the ground. The acoustics of underground stations are always peculiar, he told himself, trying to rationalize the phenomenon, but Valerius's cold mathematical logic pulsed in his mind. Time is also a dimension. Near a hyperspatial fold, causality becomes elastic and strange to the senses. He reached the main platform. The place was a vast cavern supported by wrought iron columns that vanished into the gloom. Moisture dripped from the vaulted ceiling, forming small puddles that reflected his flashlight's beam. The smell of ozone, stagnant water, and old metal flooded the air. Elias checked his notes and the metal plate. Under the flashlight, the metal's lines seemed to vibrate. He headed toward the northern end of the platform, counting his steps, seeking the exact focal point of the projected heptahedron. 23, 24, 25. He stopped dead. 15 meters away, where the dead tracks should hit a brick wall, reality was breaking. There were no explosions, no blinding lights, no sci-fi black holes. What Elias saw was infinitely more subtle and therefore infinitely more terrifying. It was a rendering error in the world. The space in front of him seemed to have fragmented into invisible prisms. Through them, light did not travel in straight lines. It fractured. It fractured at hard, impossible angles. He saw the brick wall, but simultaneously saw what was behind the wall, and it was not Earth. It was an immeasurable expanse of a throbbing, living geometry. He saw colossal structures, like crystalline skyscrapers curving over themselves, forming infinite topological knots in the void. He saw colors the human eye was not designed to process, tones existing outside the standard electromagnetic spectrum, colors that tasted like metal in his mouth and made his eyes water with pure pain. Elias stepped back, his heart pounding against his ribs with the force of a hydraulic hammer. His knees trembled as he looked up. In the epicenter of the spatial fracture, the metal plate in his backpack began to hum, a low-frequency sound that made his teeth vibrate. He pulled it out with clumsy hands. The flat surface of the metal had folded inward, like a steel flower withering in fast motion, trying to match the geometry of the distorted space before him. Then the fracture moved, not like a living entity, but like a shadow changing with the sun. The spatial fold extended, devouring 3 meters of track. And in that shift, it revealed a 3-dimensional corner where there should be none. Elias tried to focus his sight on that impossible rincon. He felt nauseous and overwhelmed. His simian brain, molded by millions of years of evolution on a flat plane, screamed at the collapse of its survival axioms. What his eyes captured could not be translated into human concepts, but his mind desperately sought an analogy. It looked like a staircase going up and left, but both directions occurred in the same vector. It was a pure mathematical path, crystallized in the air. And on that staircase, there was something. Or rather, the shadow of something. A silhouette projected against the platform from a light source that did not exist in that cavern. It was vast, angular, an amalgam of sharp edges and smooth planes in constant reorganization. He remembered Valerius's words, the blind architects. The entity's shadow seemed to perceive him, or if the dimension of time there was folded, the entity had always been perceiving him from the moment of his birth to the day of his death. Elias felt no malice in the shadow, but he felt an overwhelming, indifferent cosmic curiosity. It was like an entomologist setting aside a blade of grass to examine a frightened insect. An invisible force, a laterally oriented gravity, began pulling at his clothes, dragging him toward the fold. His mind ordered him to run, but his muscles were paralyzed by the enormity of what he was witnessing. He was on the threshold. He stood between a cardboard world and the terrifying vastness of the real universe. With Herculean effort, driven by the most primal instinct of self-preservation, Elias broke eye contact with the impossible geometry. He closed his eyes tight, let out a stifled cry, and fell backward to the ground. The blow returned him to physics. The hit against the cold concrete abruptly returned him to Newton's laws. He quickly got on his knees and, without daring to look back, began crawling frantically toward the stairs, panting like a wounded animal. The humming of the plate in his hand stopped suddenly. When he finally reached the surface, rain fell hard on Vesperia. Elias leaned against the rusted gate and vomited onto the asphalt. The icy water soaked his coat, returning the sensation of skin, of cold, of the familiar. He stayed there, trembling, for what seemed like hours, hugging himself under the flickering street lamp, observing the city buildings that now seemed strangely fragile to him. They looked thin, like papier-mâché. Elias reached into his pocket tremblingly and pulled out Valerius's plate. The object had returned to its flat, rectangular shape, but now, in the center of the engravings of tesseracts and hyperbolic spheres, a new symbol had appeared. It was a deep indentation that was not there before. It was a stylized arrow pointing toward a void. There was no turning back. He had seen the naked structure of reality and knew it was a house of cards about to collapse. The vertex he had witnessed in the subway was not a static defect. It was growing. The geometry of the invisible was not just the world's hidden skeleton. It was an invasion map, and he, Elias Thorne, disgraced topologist, was the only one who knew how to read it. He looked up at the dark, starless sky, knowing he could never again look at a simple corner without wondering what multidimensional terrors lurked, invisible, just on the other side of the angle. He breathed deep. He breathed the air of Vesperia, an air he now knew he shared with the impossible, and began to walk, determined to find the next vertex before the membrane of his universe tore completely. He would find the truth. Chapter 2: The Collapse of the Wave Function of Desire. Elias Thorne did not sleep that night, nor the next. His apartment, once a refuge of academic order and comforting silence, had metamorphosed into the interior of a feverish mind. The walls were papered with maps of Vesperia, photocopies of Valerius's diary, and veiled photographs where shadows seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Elias walked barefoot over a sea of chalk dust, dodging piles of books as if they were landmines. The cold from the underground platform had become entrenched in his bones, but what truly consumed him was the fire of revelation. He had seen the fold. He had felt the crushing gaze of the blind architects. However, the most paralyzing terror did not come from the existence of that higher dimension, but from its behavior. The fracture in the subway station had not been static. It had moved, yes, but not with the randomness of a natural phenomenon, nor with the precision of a pre-programmed machine. It had reacted to him. When Elias had felt panic, when his desire to flee, to deny reality, reached its zenith, the geometry of the pleroma had crystallized, anchoring itself in three-dimensional space with greater firmness. Sitting on the floor, under the flickering light of a dying fluorescent, Elias scribbled equations on a black chalkboard. The classical topology of Euclidean spaces had proven to be insufficient. He needed a language that described not only the shape of space, but how observation altered that shape. His chalk traced with fury the Schrödinger equation, the pillar of quantum mechanics that describes how the quantum state of a physical system changes. But he modified it. He adapted the wave function so that it described not the probability of finding a particle, but the probability of a hyperdimensional topological manifold collapsing into an observable three-dimensional structure. He wrote, erased, and wrote again, his white-stained fingers trembling with exhaustion. Huin hat het mathkal, nis extra pisai nis mathkal ins vek t, is eijbar nafraken pisai in mathkal ins vek t. In his improvised formulation, Themathkal represented the hyperspatial manifold of the pleroma, and Vec was the observation vector. But as he looked at the mathematics, Elias understood the fundamental error of his approach and the terrifying insight of Valerius. The vector Vec was not simply a passive measuring instrument. In Valerius's universe, observation was not a photon bouncing off an electron. It was human cognition. It was intention. It was desire. The collapse of the wave function, Elias whispered to himself, the sound of his voice raspy and strange in the room's solitude. Standard quantum physics was a reference. In standard quantum physics, a particle exists in a superposition of all possible states until it is observed, at which point the wave function collapses into a unique and defined state. Elias theorized that the vertices of the pleroma operated under a macroscopic and terrifyingly similar principle. What forced them to manifest? What anchored them to our fragile three-dimensional reality? The answer hit him with the force of a physical revelation. It was the human mind. More specifically, the gravitational weight of human desire. Longing, fear, obsession. These emotions were energy sinks in the fabric of reality. The architects were not simply invading. They were using the collective psyche of Vesperia as a catalyst to force the geometric collapse of their intrusions. He needed to contrast this theory. He needed a mind sharpened on the razor of empirical physics, someone who had not fallen into the abyss of n dimensions. Dr. Rostova and inflexible materialism. At noon on the third day, Elias put on a wrinkled coat, kept Valerius's plate in his inner pocket, and headed to San Severo University. The campus seemed ridiculous to him. Students walked through the quadrangular gardens, oblivious to the fact that the orthogonality of their lives was a thin crust over an ocean of chaos. Elias passed through the hallways of the Department of Modern Physics like a spectre, ignoring the inquisitive looks of his former colleagues. He pushed the door of Dr. Elena Rostova's office without knocking. Elena looked up from her monitors, where simulations of particle collisions flowed in cascades of colors. She was a woman of 50, with a steely gaze and implacable pragmatism. She had been Elias's primary detractor when he began presenting his more speculative theories on space-time topology, progressively isolating his career. "Elias," she said, her tone a mix of surprise and cold courtesy, "I heard you took leave." "I have no time for pleasantries, Elena." Elias approached her desk, resting both hands on the polished wood. "I need you to listen to me. Forget differential topology for a moment. Tell me about quantum decoherence. Tell me about the role of the observer." Elena frowned, leaning back in her ergonomic chair. "You know perfectly well what I think of mystical interpretations of quantum mechanics. The observer does not need to be conscious, Elias. A camera, a particle detector, even a photon interacting with another photon causes the collapse. Human consciousness has no privileged status in the physical universe." "That is at the subatomic level," Elias replied, his voice rising in tone. "But what happens if the observation system is of a different magnitude? What happens if the underlying quantum field of reality is being pressed by a manifold of higher dimension?" Elena sighed, a long and tired sound. "You're still with the nonsense of Emmanuel Valerius." "Elias, Valerius died in an asylum, screaming about dark angles and paper monsters. Geometry is a descriptive tool, not an entity with a will. Space does not fold magically because someone desires it." Elias was reaching his breaking point. "I saw it, Elena," Elias shouted, slamming the table, making the pens jump. "I saw it in the basement of the central station. It's not a mathematical model. It's infrastructure, and it's reacting to us. Valerius's plate." Elias reached into his coat to pull out the artifact, but he stopped dead. Touching the cold metal through the pocket lining, he felt that unnatural vibration again. If he showed it to Elena, if he allowed her to observe the reconfiguration of its impossible lines, he would be dragging her into the collapse of the wave function. He would be turning her disbelief into the anchor. He would be turning her desire to prove him crazy into the anchor that would fix another fragment of the pleroma in her office. He released it slowly and withdrew his hand, empty. "You are exhausted, Elias," Elena whispered, her voice softening with a pity that hurt him more than her disdain. "You need clinical help, not equations. The universe is complex, yes, but it is indifferent. It is not looking at you." "That is your greatest mistake, Elena," Elias said, backing toward the door, feeling a sudden chill. "The universe is indifferent, but those behind the folds are not. They look at us constantly, and they are waiting for us to look back at them so they can enter." Upon leaving the university, Elias took out the metal plate. The arrow in the center of the hyperbolic engravings had shifted slightly to the east. The theory of desire throbbed in his mind. The theater of size. If the vertices formed where the concentration of human emotion was dense enough to create a macroscopic collapse, the arrow was not guiding him toward a geological anomaly, but toward a pit of psychological gravity. He walked for hours under a leaden sky. He crossed the Lethe River, watching the waters. The muddy waters seemed to flow with an incorrect viscosity under the stone bridges. Vesperia was a city built on layers of frustrated ambition, industrial pain, and lost loves. It was a perfect battery for the architects. Valerius's hyperspatial compass led him inexorably to the Velvet District. It was the old theater and cabaret area, now a decadent labyrinth of peeling neoclassical facades and alleys choked in the smell of trash and rain. The plate in his hand vibrated with an intensity that numbed his fingers. Elias looked up. In front of him stood the Opal Theater. It had been closed for decades. It was closed in the 80s after a fire that consumed the stage and dozens of lives. The double oak doors were crossed by thick, rusty chains. Faded posters of forgotten operas hung like shreds of dead skin. The place was a sarcophagus of silenced applause, of outsized egos, of envy and acting passion. And if there was a place in Vesperia saturated with residual desire, with human projections and unresolved emotional wave functions, it was this. Elias forced a side window in the alley, breaking the brittle glass with the elbow of his coat, and slid into the dark interior. The air inside was thick. The air inside the Opal Theatre was thick, dense like dust suspended in syrup. It smelled of burnt wood, rotten velvet, and ancient dampness. Elias turned on his flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the blackness and revealing the destroyed lobby. Faceless muses stood guard by tarnished mirrors. The mirrors seemed to return a slightly delayed reflection. He advanced through the carpeted hallways toward the main hall. The absolute silence began to give way to a subauditory hum, a frequency that did not enter through the ears, but resonated directly in the sinus cavities and in the spinal cord. It was the sound of spatial tension. He pushed the padded doors of the auditorium. The immense pit of seats stretched before him, plunged in shadows. At the far end, the burnt stage looked like an open mouth, full of charred wooden teeth and twisted steel gears from the old stage machinery. Elias looked at the plate. The center of the engraving was literally red hot, emitting a glow of its own that did not burn the skin but blinded the mind. The arrow pointed to the center of the stage. Observation anchors reality, he remembered. Desire collapses geometry. He walked down the aisle. His footsteps were muffled by the debris. As he approached the stage, the air began to fracture again. But this time it was different from the subway station. In the basement, the fracture had been an inert rendering error. Here, the anomaly was boiling, actively molding and deforming itself. He stopped in the front row. In front of him, on the burnt boards, space folded over itself in a throbbing prism. Elias could see the planes of existence overlapping. He saw the destroyed stage, but he also saw the impossible geometry behind it. Violet crystal columns that ascended without end. He saw Klein surfaces swallowing their own mass in a continuous paradox and massive shadows moving in the background. Then, the pleroma interacted with the theatre. Valerius's plate burned in his hand. Elias felt the crushing pressure of the place. This was a temple built for emotional catharsis. It was a place designed to project desires toward an empty stage. The architects were using that residual energy. The wave function began to collapse before his eyes. The abstract geometry, pure and incomprehensible, began to structure itself using the latent fears and longings in the theatre walls, and perhaps Elias's own. The forms of crystal and hard light twisted, assuming vaguely recognizable contours. Space collapsed into an architectural entity. It was not a monster of flesh and blood. It was a living structure of geometry and memory. He saw an amalgam of angular faces crystallized. Faces were on the surface of a rotating polyhedron. Faces that screamed in silence, expressions of acting ecstasy and pure terror frozen in n-dimensional facets. The burnt beams of the theatre seemed to merge with the hyperspatial extensions of the entity, like roots feeding on the fire's trauma. Elias then understood the true horror of the invasion. The blind architects were not sending troops, they were sending their physical laws, and when those laws touched a node of intense human energy, they manifested using the vocabulary of our own minds, creating topological monstrosities. The rotating structure on the stage seemed to look at him. It had no eyes, but Elias felt the weight of focused attention, like a microscope lens adjusting over him. Suddenly, a figure detached itself from the central polyhedron. It was a humanoid silhouette composed of planes of light. The light intersected at impossible angles. It walked toward the edge of the stage. As he observed it, Elias felt his own mind betraying reality. The entity began to take shape, forced by Elias's act of observation to assume a defined state in this three-dimensional universe. And the shape was his. The shape it took was driven by Elias's deepest guilt, the same one that had isolated him from academia and the world. The entity acquired the texture of human skin, stretched over a geometric frame. Its face, though fragmented into facets like a cubist portrait, was unmistakable. It was Sarah. Sarah, his former fiancée, the brilliant woman who had tried to follow him in his descent into the topology of higher dimensions and who had ended up losing her mind, confined to a psychiatric clinic while he continued chasing mathematical ghosts. Elias. The voice did not sound in the air. It resonated directly in his auditory centers, an echo of overlapping frequencies that threatened to burst his eardrums. The geometric Sarah figure extended a hand toward him. Her fingers had no joints. They were elongated cones ending in points of infinite density. He felt a pull. Elias's instinct screamed at him to run, but the wave function of desire kept him pinned to the floor. A sick, broken, and pleading part of his psyche wanted it to be her. His desperation to atone for his guilt was feeding the fold, giving it density, allowing the pleroma entity to solidify. The temperature in the room dropped drastically. Frost began to climb the velvet of the seats. The entity was absorbing thermal energy from the environment to maintain its collapsed state. "You are not real," Elias whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. He closed his eyes with brutal force. He tried to cut the observation channel. "You are a mathematical shadow. You are a fold." "Visibilia sunt umbrae," the voice in his head replied, quoting the Latin from Valerius's plate, but with Sarah's melancholy tone. "And shadows are hungry, Elias. You have opened the door for us with your obsession. You have dressed us with your guilt." By closing his eyes, the auditory pressure decreased a bit. Elias suddenly remembered the lesson from the subway. Denying observation was the only defense against manifestation. Ignorance was, literally, the only physical shield left for humanity. He moved. Guided blindly by muscle memory and panic, he stumbled back. He tripped over the remains of a seat and fell backward, hitting the back of his head against the sloped floor. The pain was sharp, burning, and wonderfully anchored in three-dimensional physical reality. He used the pain as a tether. Without opening his eyes, he turned over and crawled down the carpeted aisle toward the auditorium doors. He felt the deathly cold radiating from the stage chasing him, seeking the contact of his mind to continue existing. Valerius's plate in his pocket weighed like a lead anvil. He reached the doors. He reached the padded double doors, pushed them, and rolled into the dusty lobby. Only then did he dare to open his eyes, squinting against the dim external light filtering through the broken window in the alley. The lobby was intact, empty of hyperdimensional entities. He rose slowly. Elias stood up slowly, breathing raggedly. Through the fogged glass of the auditorium doors, he saw only darkness and the charred, static stage. By breaking eye contact and denying his own desire for redemption, he had forced the entity to revert to its probabilistic wave state. He had sent it back, for now. He stepped out of the theater into the damp alley, breathing the cold, polluted air of Vesperia as if it were pure oxygen. His theory was proven beyond all reasonable doubt. The architects were not simply passive invaders, they were psychic parasites. They were using emotional geography. Vesperia was sown with places like this: hospitals, prisons, old orphanages, places saturated with pain, longing, and tragedy. Places where the wave function of human desire was about to collapse reality completely. Elias looked at his trembling hands and then the silhouette of the skyscrapers. He could no longer trust anyone. No one in the scientific world would believe him without observing the phenomenon, and if they observed it, they would make it real. The burden fell entirely on his fractured shoulders. He had to find a way to seal these vertices, to intervene in the geometry. He had to act before the weight of Vesperia's suffering tore the hinges of the third dimension forever. He clutched the plate, felt the stylized arrow pulse once more, and disappeared into the grey fog of the city, becoming the only operator in a war that no one else knew was being fought. Chapter 3. Entanglement, Synchronicity as Evidence. Terror has a very short half-life. After the peak of absolute panic, the human brain, unable to sustain such levels of cortisol and adrenaline without collapsing, is forced to rationalize, to grow numb, or to turn fear into a methodical obsession. For Elias Thorne, locked in his apartment as the storm lashed the windows, the last was the choice. The encounter at the Opal Theatre had left invisible scars on his psyche. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's geometric face fragmented into facets of hard light, feeding on his own guilt. But he could not afford the luxury of madness. If madness was the mind's surrender to reality, what Elias needed was the exact opposite. He needed a lucidity so sharp it could cut through the illusion of three-dimensional space. In front of him, pinned to the peeling wall of his living room, stretched a topographic map of Vesperia. It was crossed by red thread lines, coffee-stained sticky notes, and grainy photographs. He had two confirmed points, the subway and the theatre. At first glance, on the city's Cartesian plane, both places had no relationship. They were separated by miles of asphalt, office blocks, and the muddy bed of the Lethe River. However, in Emmanuel Valerius's diary, the engraved metal plate showed a unified structure. The transition heptahedron was not a handful of random anomalies. It was a singular object, projecting multiple shadows into our world. Elias took a few steps back, rubbing his irritated eyes. If the vertices were limbs of the same topological entity, then they could not operate independently. A connection had to exist, an invisible artery joining them. It was then that the police radio spit a report. The shortwave scanner he had bought at a pawn shop, which muttered incessantly in the corner of the room, spit out a static report. Unit 4 respond. Multiple collisions on the Bridge of Sighs, drivers reporting sudden blindness, localized dense fog, requesting medical assistance over... Elias looked at his watch. It was 03:14 a.m. He walked toward the table where he kept a stack of backdated local newspapers. He had been looking for patterns in news events, unexplained suicides, massive blackouts, collective hysteria. His fingers quickly traced the columns of text until he found a small article from the previous week. At 03:14 a.m. last Tuesday, a pipe burst. A main pipe had burst under the Opal Theatre, causing a sinkhole that swallowed a police car. And at exactly the same hour, 3 days before that, the university's seismic sensors had registered a 2.1 magnitude quake with the exact epicenter at the abandoned central subway station. Blood ran cold in his veins. It was not linear. It was not cause and effect. It was something much deeper and more terrifying. Elias pushed the newspapers aside and dragged his old black chalkboard into the center of the living room. He frantically erased yesterday's equations of the wave function of desire. He needed a new theoretical framework for this madness. The mechanics of coincidence. If the pleroma operated outside the restrictions of our three-dimensional time and space, then the distance between the subway and the theatre was an illusion dictated by our sensory limitations. For a blind architect, both points were the same point. Elias began to write. The chalk screeched against the board, tracing math. He traced the language of quantum mechanics, but applied to a macroscopic and topological scale. He wrote the formulation of quantum entanglement, the phenomenon by which two particles interact such that the quantum state of one cannot be described independently of the other, regardless of the spatial distance separating them. If we measure the spin of one entangled particle and it turns out to be up, we instantly know that its partner light years away will be down. Albert Einstein had called it, with evident disgust, spooky action at a distance. Elias formulated the hyperspatial version of this aberration. He defined Vesperia's state. He defined it as an entangled system between the topological manifold of our city, mathcall, and the projected structure of the pleroma, mathcall. Dan zitten die psi-gam, ext angle, rantian frac, sqrt hisam, inducen mathcal, angle yo times, mads mathcal, mads angle man. In this mathematical nightmare, the vertices were not isolated events. They were entangled particles at a cosmic level. What happened in the subway station instantly affected the theatre, and the bridge, and any other node forming part of the heptahedron. Synchronicity, Elias whispered in the empty room. Carl Jung had coined the term to describe meaningful coincidences lacking apparent cause. Jung thought it was evidence of a collective unconscious, of a hidden psychological architecture of the world. Valerius, a century earlier, had seen it not as psychology, but as the raw physics of higher dimensions brushing against our reality. Synchronicity was not magic. It was the observable evidence of hyperspatial entanglement. When the pressure of the pleroma increased at one node, the tension was instantly distributed through the invisible geometry to the other nodes, manifesting in our world as simultaneous catastrophes, localized weather anomalies, or outbursts of collective madness. Elias understood with paralyzing horror that he was not hunting points. He was dealing with an alien nervous system superimposed on the city. And if the architects managed to make all the vertices resonate at the same emotional frequency at the same time, the wave function collapse would not be local. It would be total. All of Vesperia would be dragged into the pleroma. The end was near. St. Lazarus Hospital. Valerius's plate resting on the wooden table began to hum with a low, constant tone. Elias picked it up. The metal was unusually cold, stealing the heat from his fingers. The hyperbolic needle engraved on its surface trembled violently, oscillating before fixing on a precise direction, northeast. He checked the map. Elias traced the line from his apartment on the map. The trajectory crossed the industrial suburbs and stopped at a massive grey block surrounded by highways, St. Lazarus General Hospital. A chill ran down his spine. If the Opal Theatre was a reservoir of old desire and extinct passions, St. Lazarus was a nuclear reactor. It was a reactor of real-time emotions. It was the largest and most saturated public hospital in the region. Inside, grief, panic, the pain of loss, desperate hope, and the terror of death seethed 24 hours a day. If the blind architects sought heavy emotional anchors, no place had higher density than that. At 5 in the morning, Elias was on the hospital grounds. The building was a mastodon of brutalist architecture, a cross-shaped concrete block that seemed to oppress the earth upon which it stood. Fluorescent lights flickered in countless windows, each the frame of a private tragedy. He didn't need to enter to feel it. The air in the parking lot was thick, almost gelatinous. The sound of ambulances arriving at the ER seemed muffled, as if traveling through water instead of air. Elias walked toward the entrance of the morgue and intensive care units at the back of the complex. He hid behind medical waste containers, taking out his notes. Here, synchronicity was palpable. It was like standing under an electrical storm, feeling the static lift the hair on his arms before the lightning strike. Elias watched his watch and began taking notes, his eyes moving between the hospital windows and the rain puddles on the asphalt. At 05:12 a.m., a nurse came out. She came through the glass emergency doors to smoke a cigarette. She looked exhausted. At the exact moment the flame of her lighter ignited, Valerius's plate in Elias's hand emitted a dull crackle. Elias looked toward the 4th floor. Intensive care. A light flickered and went out completely. Something had happened. A second later, the puddle at Elias's feet stopped reflecting the overcast sky. For a brief and impossible instant, the water reflected a structure of inverted prisms and oxidized bronze skies. Then, a raindrop broke the surface, and the illusion vanished. Entanglement, Elias noted feverishly. Someone had just died. The sudden release of emotional energy, the patient's terror, the doctor's despair, had created a micro-collapse in the spatial membrane, altering the water's refractive index on the ground and causing a simultaneous electrical failure. Cause and effect were broken. Death, light, and reflection were symptoms of the same contraction. He decided to get closer. He followed the building's perimeter until reaching a weed-choked inner courtyard surrounded by the walls of the psychiatric and oncology wings. This place was the epicenter. The metal plate vibrated with such ferocity that Elias could barely hold it. The air in the courtyard was not cold. It was absolutely devoid of temperature, a thermodynamic nullity that made his lungs ache when breathing. The shadows projected by the few working street lamps did not align with the geometry of the walls. They detached from the corners, stretching upward like vines of tar. Elias pressed against the brick wall, watching the center. The space there was fractured. It was not a majestic projection like in the theater, nor a dead crack like in the subway. It was a violent and chaotic tear. Bits of air seemed to pixelate in the darkness, showing flashes of the higher dimension, jagged shapes, spirals sucking the light, a humming silence. But he was not alone. The believer of angles, On the other side of the courtyard, partially hidden by the shadow of a diseased oak, there was a man. He wore a grey raincoat and held a thick notebook wide open. Unlike Elias, who watched the anomaly with a clinical and desperate terror, the stranger observed it with ecstatic fascination. His lips moved in a murmur. He was muttering inaudible words, as if reciting a litany or dictating instructions to the faltering structure in front of him. Elias held his breath. Who is he? Another topologist? Someone who found Valerius's diaries before me? The answer became evident with bone-chilling speed. The man was not just observing. The man in the raincoat was directing the collapse. The stranger raised a hand, his fingers contorted in a specific, almost painful-to-watch angle. Elias recognized the shape immediately. It was the two-dimensional projection of a tesseract, a human attempt to mimic the architect's geometry. It was a ritual. In response to the man's gesture, the tier in the center of the courtyard convulsed. Synchronicity exploded around them. Within a 50-meter radius, all the windows on the hospital's first floor cracked simultaneously, with a sound mimicking 1,000 catching breaths. Car alarms in the parking lot began to howl at once. They did not howl with mechanical beeps, but by emitting a purely white static shriek. The pleroma figure in the courtyard center stabilized for a second, anchoring strongly in reality. It was a monolith of sharp angles, composed of matter that absorbed light. Elias felt the immense psychological gravity of the structure. It radiated a dull pain, the concentrated suffering of hundreds of patients absorbed and transmuted into physical mass. The stranger fell to his knees, arms open toward the anomaly, like a priest offering a sacrifice to a hungry god. "Punctum est initium et finis," Elias heard the man scream above the chaos. "The shadow becomes flesh. Break the line." Elias understood then the magnitude of his error. He had assumed the pleroma's intrusion was a natural process, a passive friction between dimensions motivated by the architect's blind appetite. But he was wrong. There were accomplices, humans who understood the geometry. They understood the invisible not to seal it, but to open it wide. Mathematical cultists, topological nihilists who saw in the wave function collapse the ultimate destruction of a three-dimensional reality they loathed. The man in the raincoat was acting as a hyperspatial beacon, actively drawing the anomaly's attention. Elias knew what would happen if the structure finished solidifying. Entanglement would drag the other vertices. The subway, the theater, and places he had not yet discovered would enter a chain reaction. He had to stop it. Elias dropped his backpack, kept the plate in his pocket, and ran toward the courtyard center. He didn't know how to fight. He had no weapon. He only had mathematics. "You don't know what you're doing!" Elias shouted, throwing himself onto the back of the man in the raincoat. Both fell to the ground entangled, rolling over the frosted grass. The man was surprisingly strong, driven by fanaticism and rage. He turned violently and struck Elias in the face with his elbow. Elias felt the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, and his vision blurred. "You are the anomaly, Thorn!" the man roared, recognizing him instantly. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, pupils dilated until consuming the iris. "You and your blind equations. You try to keep us locked in this three-walled prison. They are freeing us." The stranger broke free from Elias's grip and raised his hands again toward the black monolith throbbing a few meters away. The structure emitted a high-pitched hum and a tentacle of pure geometry, a jagged Mobius strip of solid shadows, unrolled. It unrolled from its center, descending toward the man like a blessing. Elias acted out of pure scientific instinct. If observation and focused intention, desire, anchored the vertex, absolute cognitive dissonance and repulsion could destabilize it. He could not just look away. He had to introduce a chaos element. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out Valerius's plate. The metal burned. He crawled toward the man, and instead of hitting his body, he struck the stranger's notebook with all his might, using the heavy metal artifact. The sound was like the crack of a glacier splitting in two. It was a clash of frequencies. As the metal plate, a map of the pleroma, struck the notebook full of geometric invocations, the intention of collapse, a destructive paradox occurred in the local wave function. Elias's intention to close clashed violently with the man's intention to open. The air imploded. A silent shockwave swept the courtyard. Elias felt his lungs empty and gravity invert for a nanosecond. The sharp-angled monolith shrank into itself with a deafening screech, like a cassette tape rewinding at extreme speed. The Mobius strip of shadows disintegrated into a rain of immaterial ash. The vertex collapsed, fleeing back to the pleroma. The blow threw Elias and the stranger several meters back. Elias rolled on the frozen asphalt, gasping and clutching his aching ribs. When he looked up, coughing, the anomaly had vanished. The air had returned to normal temperature. Rain fell in straight lines dictated by Earth's gravity. The man lay groaning. The man in the raincoat lay on the ground, writhing in pain and clutching his head. His notebook burned with a pale green flame, consuming itself without smoke. Before Elias could stand to restrain him, the fanatic scrambled up, staggering. He looked at Elias with a hatred that transcended the human. "You've broken the chain, Thorn," the man spat, his voice trembling with effort. "But the web is already woven. You only delay the fold. The High Architect is already in Vesperia, and she has the key to the epicenter." The man turned on his heels and disappeared, running among the ambulance shadows. He was limping but fast, vanishing into the darkness before Elias could take a step to follow. Elias was left alone in the St. Lazarus courtyard, in the rain, with the taste of blood and fear in his mouth. The metal plate beside him had cooled completely. The situation had just mutated from science to war. He wasn't just fighting the blind architects, alien creatures of incomprehensible physics. Now he was fighting a human sect, fanatics orchestrating tragedies to draw hyperdimensional entities into the city. And he had mentioned someone else, the High Architect, the epicenter. Elias picked up his backpack. He felt the crushing weight of Vesperia on his shoulders. Synchronicity had shown him that all points were connected, but every entangled system has a gravitational core, a zero point from which the collapse wave propagates. He needed to find that epicenter before the sect used it to tear the reality's canvas for good. Chapter 4. The Measure of Coherent Intent. Physical pain is an excellent three-dimensional anchor. While his ribs burned with every breath and his split lip reminded him of the rusty taste of his own blood, Elias Thorn managed to crawl back to his apartment. Vesperia remained shrouded in a perpetual drizzle, indifferent to the topological war being waged in its blind spots. He collapsed onto the frayed sofa without removing his soaked coat. Emmanuel Valerius's metal plate rested on the coffee table, inert, heavy, and silent. Elias closed his eyes and relived the confrontation in the courtyard of St. Lazarus Hospital. The fanatic in the raincoat was not an isolated madman. He was a node in a network. If the blind architects were the hydraulic pressure of the pleroma trying to burst the pipes of our reality, that human sect was the suicidal plumber loosening the valves from within. And they had mentioned a high architect, an epicenter. Elias's problem was no longer just locating hyperspatial anomalies. Intent was needed, the thermodynamics of consciousness. At dawn, Elias forced himself up. He prepared a whole pot of coffee and stood before his blackboard. He erased the scribbles about entanglement and synchronicity. The system had changed. He was no longer measuring a natural phenomenon. He was chasing hunters. If human consciousness acted as the observation vector, then intent must leave a mark. In standard quantum physics, coherence describes a state where quantum waves are in perfect phase, allowing them to interfere constructively or destructively. Elias postulated that the cultists operated under a principle of coherent intent. By synchronizing their minds on a specific topological goal, they created a psychic gravity well. He took the chalk and began to formulate a mathematical model to track them. He defined an intentionality tensor, $, representing the flux density of focused human observation. If general relativity dictated that mass and energy curved 3D space-time, he theorized coherent intent curved the pleroma border. He wrote the coupling equation on the blackboard. Dalorabladradica mushmatkal, ufrak en matkal. Shikapa shusidot omega. Xtida, where no mega manction externalis represented the incoming hyperspatial tension, and kappa was Vesperia's dimensional permeability constant. Elias stepped back, fascinated and terrified. If the equation was correct, the sect did not emit noise, It emitted a terrifying order. They were reducing local entropy to build a bridge. But how to measure the tensor hum math call dollars in the real world? He needed an interferometer, a device capable of detecting the resonance between the plate and the mind's manipulating geometry. He dismantled his old police radio scanner. He extracted the quartz oscillators and the broadband antenna. Then, with reverential care, he placed Valerius's plate in the center of an improvised circuit on the kitchen table. He used copper wires to connect the hyperbolic metal edges to the radio terminals, forcing current through it. The goal was not to pick up radio frequency waves, but to use the radio's electromagnetic sensitivity to amplify the microacoustic and thermal vibrations of the plate when it resonated with a focus of coherent intent. He turned on the device. At first, there was only white static. A constant monotonous hum filled the small kitchen. Elias spent hours calibrating the potentiometers, adjusting the empirical resistance against the esoteric mystery of the metal. Outside, the afternoon faded into a starless night. Vesperia turned on its neon and sodium lights, oblivious to the physical heresy brewing in its bosom. At 10:40 p.m., the sound changed into a rhythm. The static did not disappear, but it organized itself. Suddenly, the radio speaker emitted a rhythmic pattern, a pulsating low-frequency hum, like the heartbeat of a mechanical heart. It was not the chaotic, painful noise of the hospital. It was a sustained, harmonic tone, a chord of pure intent seeking to pierce the universe. Elias grabbed the plate. The arrow engraving on its surface had lit up with a faint cerulean glow and pointed with absolute firmness toward the city's geographical south. The financial and academic heart of Vesperia. There was something deeply unsettling about following a compass that did not point to magnetic north. The Athenaeum of Vesperia. He followed a concentration of interdimensional fanaticism. Elias walked through the wet avenues, holding the improvised device hidden under his coat. The rhythmic thumping in his earpiece grew louder, sharper, as he moved into the district of the consuls. Unlike the Victorian alleys, this area was a testament to human arrogance. Glass and steel skyscrapers stood like perfect monoliths, defying gravity with relentless, straight lines. The pulse guided him to Reason Square, a vast, open space paved with grey granite slabs. In the exact center of the square rose the Athenaeum of Vesperia. It was a building of austere neoclassical architecture, founded in the late 19th century as a private club for the city's brightest minds, scientists, philosophers, industrialists, and mathematicians. It had immense Doric columns and a marble staircase that commanded respect. It was always rumored that the true political and economic decisions were made in its smoking rooms. Elias stopped behind the bronze statue of a forgotten astronomer, looking at the imposing facade. The earpiece in his ear throbbed with such violence it threatened to deafen him. The arrow on the plate pointed directly at the building's double mahogany doors. There was no trace of madness here. Everything was orderly. Everything was neat, illuminated by discreet halogen spotlights. And that was precisely what made it infinitely more terrifying. Coherent intent required order. Chaos was the enemy of controlled collapse. The main entrance was guarded by two stoic-looking security guards. Elias knew he could not enter through there. He circled the block's perimeter, seeking a weakness in the building's armor. He found a narrow service alley intended for loading and unloading kitchen and maintenance supplies. The steel back door was closed by an electronic code panel. Elias was not a spy, but topology had taught him to see hidden connections. He took Valerius's plate and brought it close to the numeric keypad. The hyperbolic metal, coming into proximity with the basic electrical circuits, generated localized electromagnetic interference. The digits flickered. The magnetic locking mechanism emitted a dull click as it confused its own voltage states, and the door yielded. He entered, plunging into the belly of the building, the geometry of the elite. The service hallways were a labyrinth of exposed pipes, ventilation ducts, and the smell of industrial cleaning products. Elias advanced in silence, guided by the increase in the hum's amplitude in his earpiece. Every step he took toward the Athenaeum's interior felt like walking through an oppressive magnetic field. The air was heavy, saturated with a cold expectation. He reached a leather-lined double door that gave access to the club's exclusive areas. He pushed it carefully and peered into a corridor carpeted in a rich crimson tone. The walls were adorned with oil portraits of past benefactors and display cases of instruments. The rhythmic sound of his device led him toward the end of the hallway, toward the Pendulum Hall, the Athenaeum's largest and most prestigious conference room. The solid oak doors were ajar. A faint light, projected from inside, drew a line on the carpet. Elias hugged the wall, holding his breath, and peered in. What he saw destroyed any residual hope that this was a marginal problem. The Pendulum Hall was an architectural marvel crowned by a glass dome. In the center of the room, an immense Foucault pendulum swung slowly from the ceiling, tracing the Earth's rotation. However, the attention was not on the pendulum itself. At least 60 people were gathered. They didn't wear ceremonial robes or cultist clothes from a cheap movie. They wore tailored suits, sober designer dresses, silk ties. Elias recognized faces. He saw a prominent cardiovascular surgeon, 2 appellate court judges, the CEO of Vesperia's largest bank, and academics. They were arranged in concentric circles around the pendulum, sitting in high-backed chairs. All had their eyes open, but their gazes were unfocused, fixed on the void. They did not mutter chants. They kept an absolute and glacial silence. It was a synchronized meditation, a forced alignment of wills. They were a mass. In the center of the hall, just under the pendulum's pivot point, stood a dark wood lectern. And standing behind the lectern, orchestrating the silence, was the High Architect. Elias felt the 3D ground disappear beneath his feet. It was not a pleroma entity in disguise. It was not a monster. It was Dr. Elena Rostova. The betrayal of materialism. Eleanor wore a sober grey suit jacket. Her posture was the same she used when lecturing on quantum mechanics at the university. Upright, dominant, exhaling unshakable intellectual authority. But instead of a laser pointer, she held an object in her left hand that made Elias's breath catch. It was an octahedral prism. It was composed of a translucent matter that did not reflect ambient light but seemed to swallow it, emitting a sickly ultraviolet glow in return. It was a pure hyperspatial anchor, a solidified fragment of the pleroma, far more advanced and dangerous than the simple 2-dimensional plate Elias possessed. It was power. Elena raised her right hand and with a sharp gesture ordered the end of the meditation. The 60 people blinked in unison, emerging from the collective trance without a single sound of confusion. The discipline was military. The hum in Elias's earpiece decreased its high frequency, transforming into a latent echo. Coherence reaches the Phase 4 threshold, Elena spoke, her voice projecting through the hall without a microphone. Her tone was clinical, devoid of religious passion, and therefore terrifying. The membrane in the St. Lazarus sector showed resistance, but the global topological flexion has increased by 2.4%. A murmur of orderly approval rippled through the elite audience. The problem with classical materialism, my esteemed colleagues, Elena continued, walking slowly around the lectern, is that it assumes what we can measure with our crude 3D instruments is the totality of reality. I defended that illusion. We believed the wave function collapse was a blind process, dictated by inorganic devices. She paused and raised the dark prism. But Valerius was right, though his language was primitive. Consciousness is the fundamental gravity of the multiverse. And the blind architects have shown us the geometry. They have shown us the geometry of salvation. Elias clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. Salvation. That was the lie with which she had recruited the city's most rational minds. She was using them. She was using their shared intelligence to tear the world apart from the inside. This 3D universe is a thermodynamic prison, Elena explained, her voice acquiring a controlled fervor. We are trapped in the arrow of time, condemned to entropy, aging, the decay of flesh and space. We move in 3 pathetic directions toward inevitable death, but the pleroma does not know entropy. On the other side of right angles, in the volume of n dimensions, time is a geography we can traverse at will. Matter does not decompose. It reconfigures. Elena looked at her audience, making eye contact with the judges and bankers. What the rabble calls invasion or anomalies are simply birth pangs. They are the birth pangs of our ascension. We are not worshippers of foreign gods. We are the engineers of the deployment. Using the synchronization of our minds, we are acting as the wedge that will open Vesperia's lock. When the heptahedron vertices align, the city will be transposed to the pleroma. We will transcend biology. We will become pure, immortal topological forms. They are mad, Elias thought, panic bubbling in his chest. They don't understand the scale. If they try to force a city of millions to collapse into 4D geometry, they won't ascend them. They will compress them. They will annihilate them. Elena approached the lectern again. However, there is friction in the system, unaccounted variables. The incident at St. Lazarus Hospital was interrupted. Someone introduced a local topological dissonance that forced the vertex to retract. The silence in the hall became dense and threatening. It was heavy. Elias Thorne, Elena pronounced, and the name fell like a lead slab. He survived direct contact at the central station and possesses a Valerius mapping artifact. His mind is brilliant, but it is infected by sentimental attachment to this 3D prison. He will try to intervene at the epicenter. He must be stopped. A middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, stood up. Elias recognized him instantly. It was Marcus Vane, the police chief of Vesperia's North Zone. Dr. Rostova, if Thorne becomes a vector of dissonance, we must neutralize him before the Great Alignment. Standard authorities can detain him. Do not underestimate Mr. Thorne, Elena replied, with a cold smile. He is an exceptional topologist. He has already discovered how to read the pleroma's currents. We cannot rely on standard police tools against someone learning to navigate outside Euclidean geometry. We need to track his intentional signature. As Elena spoke, Elias felt the plate in his pocket beginning to heat up again. The improvised device in his hand buzzed, but this time it was not a rhythmic pulse. It was a high-pitched, sustained beep, a proximity alarm. The coherent intent of the room had just changed direction. They were looking for him. The 60 hyper-synchronized minds were now focused on him. The black prism in Elena's hand flashed. She slowly turned her head, her grey eyes stabbing directly at the slit in the oak doors, crossing the exact distance to Elias's eyes. In a mechanistic universe, it was impossible for her to know he was there. But in the framework of the intentionality tensor, Elias's fear and repulsion had shone like an emergency flare in the room's dimensional darkness. "He is here," Elena said, her voice devoid of surprise, almost pleased. Elias did not wait another second. He dropped the device and ran down the hallway. Behind him, there were no shouts or the sound of falling chairs, which was infinitely more frightening. There was an orchestrated movement, the simultaneous sound of dozens of people rising at the same time, driven by a single will. Elias ran toward the service doors through which he had entered the building. The hallway seemed to lengthen under his feet. His brain, exhausted and subjected to the extreme stress of near entanglement, began to perceive errors in the architecture. Oil paintings on the walls seemed to curve outward, watching him with distorted faces. The carpet felt spongy, like treading on breathing lungs. The sect was using their intent to warp the hallway, trying to trap him in a topological loop before he reached the exit. "Focus on classical space," Elias shouted to himself. "Up, down, left, right. Distance equals speed times time." He repeated Euclidean axioms aloud as a protective spell. He crashed through the leather swing doors and plunged into the service area. Lights flickered violently, threatening to burst from the static charge. He reached the steel back door. He pressed the latch and threw himself into the alley, tripping over some trash cans. The cold rain hit his face. The rain broke the building's geometric oppression. He got up and ran toward the main avenue, losing himself among the sparse night traffic and the shadows of buildings, not daring to look back. He had survived, but the outlook was bleak. His enemies were the city's elite, led by Dr. Elena Rostova. They controlled resources, information, and most dangerously, they had a terrifying control over the macroscopic wave function. She had mentioned the epicenter and the Great Alignment. Vesperia was about to be torn from reality, and Elias was the only loose nail preventing the machinery from closing completely. Walking in the rain, with Valerius's plate throbbing warmly against his chest, Elias knew the research phase was over. Now it was a race to find the heptahedron's focal point before Dr. Rostova and her entourage of disaster engineers activated it irreversibly. He had to save the city from its own architects. Chapter 5. The Singularity of the Instant. Rain in Vesperia no longer fell with the chaotic randomness of a meteorological phenomenon. As Elias Thorne fled through the dark alleys away from the Athenaeum, he observed how water droplets seemed to organize into subtle patterns, forming striated curtains that defied wind currents. The coherent intent was altering probability. The sect of Elena Rostova was altering local probability at a subatomic level. The entire city was becoming deterministic. When he finally reached the relative safety of his apartment, he locked the door, slid the bolt, and leaned against the peeling wood, sliding down until he sat on the floor. His lungs burned and his hands shook. His hands trembled so much he could barely hold Valerius's metal plate. The silence of his home, usually comforting, now felt threatening to him. The corners of the room seemed too sharp, the shadows too dense. Elena Rostova was not just a cult leader. She was one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of her generation. She had taken the theoretical topology Elias had sketched and turned it into applied engineering. She wanted to tear Vesperia from the third dimension and hurl it into the pleroma, believing that the annihilation of entropy equaled immortality. Elias stood up with agonizing effort and walked toward his blackboard. He had to calculate. He could no longer merely react. If the elite of Vesperia were forcing the great alignment, he had to calculate where and when the final tear would occur. He needed to find the epicenter. Until then, Elias had treated the vertices, the subway, the theater, the hospital, as simple spatial coordinates, x, y, z. He was biased. The time coordinate. Mapping the transition. Heptahedron as an invisible building anchored in the city was the bias of a 3D brain. In the physics handled by the blind architects, time was not an inexorable arrow pushing events forward. It was a fourth spatial dimension. Just another axis. Elias took a clean piece of chalk to define the synchronization. If the pleroma was to manifest in its totality, it needed not only spatial alignment, but temporal synchronization. The heptahedron was not a static structure. It was an event, a collision between two geometries occurring at a specific hyperspatial point. The singularity of the instant, Elias muttered, writing the concept. If cultists were gathering psychic mass to force the collapse, they needed a moment of maximum gravitational tension in the solar system to facilitate the topological tear. Tides do not only affect water, they affect the curvature of space-time. Elias approached his desk and pushed aside newspapers to find an almanac. His eyes frantically scanned data columns, moon phases, planetary transits, perigees. He stopped on the date of the next day, Friday, October 24th, planetary syzygy. An almost perfect alignment of the Sun, Earth, Moon, and Jupiter, coinciding with a total lunar eclipse at exact midnight. It was an astronomical rarity. It maximized gravitational tension on the Earth's crust. For astrologers, it was an omen. For a hyperdimensional topologist, it was the equivalent of pushing a needle through a fabric already stretched to its breaking point. That was the moment, teaser dollar. Tomorrow's midnight. Barely 24 hours remained. Now he needed space. He returned to the map on his wall. He had 4 confirmed vertices and suspected 2 others based on old urban legends Valerius had noted. The old Blackwood Prison and the Iron Hills Cemetery. 6 external points. If the projected structure was a regular heptahedron in n dimensions, its shadow would follow rules. It would follow precise rules of barycentric symmetry. Elias began to trace vectors from each node, calculating the topological center of mass of the resulting figure. He wrote the equation of the projected hyperspatial centroid. Pavek munkaven ext en frak norsum. Mi unvek norsum. Ansidot arcios. Heta ol exta. Where $, was the intentional mass of each node, and Heta $ was the incidence angle of the pleroma. Red thread lines on his map crossed relentlessly, forming a dense network of intersections converging at a single point, an empty space in the geographic center of the metropolis. Elias dropped the chalk. The chalk snapped as it hit the wooden floor. The epicenter was not a hidden building. It was the temporal reference point of the entire city. It was the monumental clock tower of Vesperia. Built in Meridian Square, it was a Gothic spire of black stone and bronze gears rising over 100 meters high. It had been designed by an architect contemporary to Emmanuel Valerius. Elias suddenly remembered a historical detail. The clock's architect had committed suicide shortly after finishing the tower, leaving a note stating the gears turned inward toward the corner where God does not look. The tower was the antenna. Dr. Rostova and her elite planned to use the Athenaeum's pendulum and the astronomical syzygy to channel all the vertices' energy toward the tower's needle, tearing Vesperia's sky at exact midnight. Knowing where and when was useless without a weapon. You cannot shoot a mathematical equation or bomb a fold. The topology of the cage. Elias sat on the sofa, holding Valerius's plate. The artifact was designed as a compass, a map to read the pleroma. But what if it was also a key? If the sect used harmonic resonance to open the door, coherence, Elias needed to generate a perfect topological isolation to close it. He needed a closed space. He needed a space that could not be invaded, because mathematically it had no defined inside or outside for the pleroma to connect. His mind flew toward abstract concepts, non-orientable surfaces, the Mobius strip in 2D, the Klein bottle in 3D. A Klein bottle is a closed surface with no edges. It does not delimit any strict volume in our space. Its Euler characteristic is zero, by $0. If Elias could generate a field with Klein bottle properties around the epicenter during the alignment, the energy channeled by Rostova would not tear reality. It would enter the bottle and slide over itself. It would feed back in an infinite sterile loop. Hyperdimensional energy would devour itself, nullifying the wave function collapse. The math supporting this was the divergence theorem, adapted for a manifold with hyperspatial stress. 9 partial hammath kal hamamath bf and 1 d sigmat muhense c $. For the stress tensor, a math bf to Dudler's flux integral to be zero, Elias needed to invert the plate's polarity. He had to turn the map into a shield. He flipped the metal plate. The back was smooth, except for the 3 Latin phrases. Visibilia sunt umbrae. Anguli celant ostia. Punctum est initium et finis. He ran to his toolbox and pulled out a diamond-tipped precision Dremel. Guided by desperation and an eidetic memory for differential equations, he began to engrave the metal's flat surface. He did not trace straight lines. He engraved the parameterization equations for a 3D immersion of the Klein bottle. Metal dust sparked, slightly burning the skin of his arms. As the engravings took shape, the plate's temperature dropped drastically, as if the act of writing the topology of isolation was sucking the heat from the room. Frost formed at the edges, but a static engraving was not enough for the clock tower. To generate a field to wrap the tower, the plate needed to be energized at the exact moment of alignment. His police radio provided only a few volts. He needed a massive electromagnetic pulse, something to force the plate's geometry to project outward and rewrite the local structure of space-time. He needed power. He needed a high-voltage capacitor, or, failing that, the plasma condensers from the particle physics department of San Severo University. The same department controlled by Dr. Elena Rostova. It was 3 in the afternoon on Friday. 9 hours remained until midnight. Elias packed the modified plate. Wrapped in thick cloth to isolate its unnatural cold, he went out. The city was unrecognizable. There was no mass panic, which was even more chilling. Instead, there was a collective lethargy, a dense somnambulism. Cars moved slowly. Pedestrians walked with empty gazes. The pleroma's pressure was depressing the city. The sky was a sickly gray, a ceiling of clouds that seemed hundreds of meters lower than normal. Elias crossed the gates of San Severo. The gardens were deserted. Silence was total, except for the electric hum of street lamps lit in broad daylight. He headed for the exact sciences building he knew well. He avoided security cameras using maintenance tunnels, a suffocating labyrinth of asbestos-wrapped pipes that left him covered in sweat and grey dust. Exiting through a vent on the third floor, Elias immediately felt the anomaly. The physics department hallway was not a Euclidean corridor. Rostova's sect worked here. Floor tile lines were no longer parallel. They converged at a point on the horizon that seemed impossibly situated behind the wall itself. Fluorescent light did not diffuse uniformly. It curved, cascading as if it had weight. Elias closed one eye, using his hand to cover part of his field of vision to avoid vertigo. The theft at San Severo. He reached the high-energy laboratory door. The electronic lock had been ripped out, wires hanging inert. Someone, or something, had forced entry. He pushed the door. The interior looked as if it had been subjected to momentary zero gravity. Broken computers floated half a meter above the floor in stasis pockets. Blackboards were covered in the same equations Elias had seen in Valerius's diary, but written in what looked like oxidized blood. In the center, anchored to the cement floor, was the titanium cylinder of the portable plasma condenser. It was the size of a large coffee thermos, designed to release gigajoules of energy. Elias ran toward it. He disconnected it from the central power matrix, his hands moving with the speed of panic. The cylinder weighed at least 10 kilos. He shoved it into his backpack. "It will be of no use to you, Elias," a voice echoed behind him. Elias froze. He turned slowly toward the dark hallway. Floating a palm's width from the floor was Marcus Vane, the police chief he had seen at the Athenaeum. He was no longer entirely human. His figure's edges blurred, vibrating rapidly. His eyes had no pupils or irises. They were spheres of pure light-emitting whiteness. The alignment was altering the initiates. "Chief Vane is no longer, strictly speaking, here," said the entity wearing the policeman's face, its voice sounding directly in Elias's mind. "He is halfway, as the whole city will be at midnight. Leave the condenser, Thorn. Materialism is a phase humanity must overcome." Elias backed away desperately. The laboratory's geometry was unstable. He saw a bottle of pressurized liquid nitrogen near one of the floating tables. "You're not evolving, Vane," Elias shouted, grabbing a heavy wrench from a workbench. "You're surrendering order in favor of blind chaos. The architects don't see you as gods. You are a door." Without hesitation, Elias threw the wrench with all his might against the nitrogen cylinder's valve. The metal clashed with a sharp crash. The valve fractured. Pressurized gas at nearly 200 degrees below zero shot out in a blinding cloud of white mist, flooding the room instantly. It was a massive variable. The sudden temperature change introduced a massive thermodynamic variable, destabilizing the fragile hyperspatial topology the entity used to manifest. Elias heard Vane let out a scream like tearing metal, a static and inhuman sound. Taking advantage of the frozen mist, Elias lunged for the side emergency door. He pushed the panic bar and rolled onto the exterior stairs. Vesperia's humid air greeted him like an embrace. He jumped down the steel steps 3 at a time, the heavy condenser thumping painfully against his back. At 11:15 p.m., Elias was on the roof of an abandoned commercial building 200 meters from the square. The clock tower stood majestic in the dark, its Gothic silhouette lit by amber floodlights. Something was fundamentally wrong. The hands of the immense clock, marking 11:15, moved in jerks, stepping back 1 second for every 2 they advanced. The night sky over Vesperia was not just overcast, it was bruised. It was a deep electric violet announcing the lunar eclipse. Elias set up his equipment at the roof's edge. He extracted the modified plate and the plasma condenser. He used jumper cables and thick copper wire to connect the condenser terminals directly to the metal plate's edges. The circuit was ready for the strike. He looked toward the tower's base. It was surrounded. Dozens of figures in dark coats formed perfect circles around the monument. They were the Athenaeum elite, the St. Lazarus cultists, and others. They stood motionless under the drizzle, faces turned toward the spire. In the center he saw Elena Rostova. She held the octahedral prism high, glowing with an ultraviolet light that pierced the darkness like a laser. The pleroma's hum was now a physical vibration in the concrete under Elias's boots, a low-frequency sound loosening his teeth. Entanglement was reaching critical mass. Nearby, transformers exploded and glass shattered. At 11:55 p.m., reality began to tear. It wasn't subtle. Space around the clock tower's tip fractured like a windshield hit by a stone. Pieces of 3D sky seemed to peel away, revealing the seething abyss of the fourth dimension. Inside, Elias saw colossal structures and shadows, the blind architects, crowding the threshold. Gravity became unstable. Elias felt his body lose weight, then become immensely heavy. The air filled with ozone and blood. "Not yet," he whispered, finger on the discharge switch. "It has to be the point of maximum tension, the singularity." At 11:58 p.m., Rostova's prism emitted a blinding flash of light. A column of hard light, in a color non-existent in the visible spectrum, shot from the tower base toward the spire, hitting the clock gears. The hands began to spin at dizzying speed, synchronizing with the pleroma's rhythm. The tower spire seemed to curve toward an impossible angle, stabbing the sky fracture. At 11:59:40 p.m., Elias activated the condenser. "By Euclidean geometry," he muttered, like a prayer to a dead god of reason. He flipped the switch. A gigajoule of energy crashed into Valerius's plate. The metal howled. There was a flash of bluish light that buried the roof and projected toward the square. The topological wave, structured with Klein bottle geometry, crossed the distance in an instant. When the invisible field collided with Rostova's column and the sky fracture, the universe held its breath. Elias watched, heart stopped, as pure math clashed against interdimensional fanaticism. The war for reality had begun. Chapter 6: Resonance and Correspondence. The silence following the plasma condenser's activation was not an absence of sound. It was an acoustic wall, a negative pressure that sucked all noise from Vesperia. For a fraction of a second that seemed to span geological eras, Elias Thorne saw the topological wave expand from the roof. It was invisible to the human eye. His mind, trained in the abysses of differential geometry, perceived the deformation of the air. It was like observing a spherical soap bubble trying to turn itself inside out without breaking. Emmanuel Valerius's plate, engraved with the structure of a Klein bottle, was projecting its mathematical anomaly onto the fabric of space-time. 200 meters away, in Meridian Square, the ultraviolet column invoked by Dr. Elena Rostova acted as a cosmic drill, widening the wound in the universe's membrane. The massive shadows of the blind architects throbbed on the other side of the fracture, monstrosities of impossible angles and intersecting surfaces, hungry to spill. They were hungry to spill over the three-dimensional city. And then the topological shield crashed into the beam. There was no fire. There were no flying debris. What occurred was a collapse of spatial correspondence. Elias was knocked down by a force that was not kinetic but dimensional. He fell backward onto the roof's gravel. He did not feel the impact. Suddenly, gravity ceased to be a vector pointing toward the center of the earth. The violet sky, the clock tower, the glass buildings, and the cultist figures in the square fragmented into a kaleidoscope of seething prisms. Reality was shattering. Elias opened his eyes to a world that was no longer his own. The liminal space. He was no longer on the commercial building's roof, or at least, not in the 3D version of it. He stood upon a plane of crystallized light, an infinite plane that seemed to extend in every imaginable direction at once. There was no sky or floor, only a vast and oppressive whiteness shot through with streaks of color he could not process. The air had no temperature or smell. It was the liminal space, the exact border where the Euclidean universe of Vesperia rubbed against the pleroma. "Resistance is an endearing human trait, Elias," a voice echoed behind him. Elias turned. Elena Rostova was there. She no longer wore the sober grey suit from the Athenaeum. Her physical body seemed translated into pure mathematics. Her skin glowed with mother-of-pearl iridescence, and her contours fluctuated as if being constantly rendered by a computer trying to guess her four-dimensional shape. In her hand, the octahedral prism still burned with that sickly ultraviolet light. She was the architect. "It is not resistance, Elena," Elias replied. He was surprised to find his voice did not vibrate in the air, for there was no air, but was transmitted by pure conceptual resonance. "It is survival." The topology you are trying to force will not elevate us. It is going to compress us into nothingness. You are destroying us." Elena smiled with infinite indulgence. She walked toward him, and with every step, the space around her shrank and stretched, obeying her coherent intent. "You still think in terms of volume, of continents needing space to exist. Look at them, Elias." Elena pointed up toward the sky of that liminal space. There, floating like leviathans in an ocean of static, were the blind architects. Seen up close, they were not biological beings. They were ecosystems of pure geometry. Elias could see hypercubes rotating within spheres, which in turn formed the edges of polyhedra swallowing their own mass. They were terrifyingly beautiful. They were a mathematical perfection, lacking any trace of warmth, empathy, or life, as humanity understood it. "They know no decay," Elena continued, her voice filled with cold ecstasy. "They do not suffer entropy. By merging Vesperia with the Pleroma, I am stopping the clock. I am eradicating the disease of mortality. The entire city will become an immutable theorem." "An immutable theorem is a dead city," Elias replied, clenching his fists. He felt the ghost weight of the plasma condenser on his back, an echo of his own 3D reality anchoring him. "Life is a thermodynamic process, Elena. We require friction. We require the arrow of time. We need it for our actions to have meaning. If you turn us into a static equation in 4 dimensions, we will no longer be human. We will be frozen shadows in a block of mathematical amber." Elena looked at him with pity. "And what is humanity but a larval state? You are trying to catch an ocean in a glass of water, Elias. Your shield is ingenious, I admit, a non-orientable surface, a Klein bottle projected at a macroscopic scale, but it is an empty structure. Sooner or later, the immensity of the Pleroma will overflow it." She was confident. Elias knew she was partly right. His shield could not hold forever against the oceanic energy. The mutual destruction equation. The energy flowing from the clock tower, fueled by the planetary syzygy and mass meditation, was overwhelming. But Elena had made a fundamental calculation error, the same one theoretical physicists made when ignoring real-world friction. "I don't intend to contain the ocean, Elena," Elias said, stepping toward her. The light plane trembled under his imaginary feet. "I intend for it to drown in itself." Elias raised his hand. Although not physically holding Valerius's plate, in this hyperspace, his mathematical understanding manifested as a white chalk hologram glowing in the air. He traced the resonance equation of his shield. Dauer Mathkal. Math BF T. Int. Dapisai P Math BF T. Istar Jafai K Math BF. Chamath BF T. Danex Dae. Elena looked at the floating symbols, and for the first time, her expression of unshakable superiority wavered. "The convolution operator," she whispered, her grey eyes moving quickly over the equation. "You are multiplying the Pleroma wave function, Kupsai Taz, by your topological field function, Boros Pi Kdas." "Exactly," Elias nodded, his voice gaining strength from the pure certainty of mathematics. "You are using the clock tower to inject an infinite amount of dimensional energy into our space, but my plate has wrapped the epicenter in a closed topology with no inside or outside." Elias drew a Klein bottle in the air. The shape, looking like a vase whose neck curved to pierce its own wall and connect with its base, rotated slowly. "When the ultraviolet beam from your prism hits the bottle's barrier, it cannot enter, because mathematically there is no inside. Nor can it bounce out, because there is no delimited outside. The Pleroma's energy is forced to travel along the bottle's surface." Elena's eyes widened as she understood the geometric trap. "It slides along the surface, and since it is a non-orientable figure, the energy returns to the source point with inverted phase." She realized the consequence. The loop was closing. "Perfect destructive interference," Elias concluded, with heavy sadness in his heart. "You are pumping the architect's force into an infinite feedback loop. The more coherent intent you and your sect project to open the tear, the more hyperspatial energy will be returned against yourselves, crushing the prism. It would collapse the tunnel." The crystalline light of the liminal space began to vibrate violently. A deafening howl, composed of a billion simultaneous frequencies, tore through the infinite whiteness. Above, the architect's vast shadows agitated in panic. They did not have human emotions, but they understood physics. They understood the physics of the infinite. They were feeling the rejection. The energy they tried to pour over Vesperia was being spat back at their pleroma structures, creating topological black holes in their geometric bodies. "No!" Elena screamed. The octahedral prism in her hand began to crack. The light flickered. Ascension is inevitable. The alignment guarantees it. "The planetary alignment only provides the gravity," Elias shouted over the cosmic noise, which sounded like galaxy-sized glass breaking. "But topology dictates the form, and I have dictated that the form be a cage for yourselves." The structure was failing. Elena's geometric structure began to crumble, her pearly skin filled with fissures. By forcing the pleroma link through the prism, she had become quantumly entangled with the architect's energy. And now that energy was violently receding in an infinite loop. It was dragging her with it. She was fading. "Elias," Elena's voice broke, losing its n-dimensional resonance and becoming that of the tired materialist woman he had known. "There is so much mathematical light, so much perfection. It is a cold light, Elena, and I prefer the warmth of the shadow." The octahedral prism in her hand exploded into a billion fragments. The fragments were of pure darkness. Simultaneously, the white void of the liminal space imploded. The connection was severed. The recoil, three-dimensional reality returned like a hammer blow to the chest. Elias let out a dull, stifled cry as his lungs abruptly filled with Vesperia's damp, polluted air. He lay sideways on the roof, soaked by the rain falling with the same oblique melancholy as always. The smell of ozone was so strong it made him gag. Beside him, the plasma condenser was melted, a shapeless mass of titanium and burnt plastic. The discharge's extreme heat had melted Valerius's metal plate. What was once an intricate hyperbolic map was now a smooth, blackened, dead metal disc, fused forever to the roof's asphalt. The shield had consumed itself. Coughing violently, Elias crawled to the parapet's edge and looked down at Meridian Square. The clock tower still stood. Its massive bronze hands had stopped, frozen exactly at 000. The lunar eclipse, invisible behind Vesperia's thick storm clouds, had reached totality and was beginning to wane. In the square, the sex-ordered chaos had been annihilated. The elite cultists, judges, surgeons, bankers, were scattered across the grey granite like puppets with cut strings. They were not dead, but something fundamental had been extracted. Elias watched as some began to move slowly, rising with the clumsiness of newborns. They looked at their own hands as if not recognizing their existence. The Klein bottle's feedback loop had overloaded their coherent intent, burning the neural circuits connecting them to the pleroma's fanaticism. They were empty shells, forced to learn to inhabit the 3D world from scratch. They were broken. In the exact center of the square, under the clock doors, was a circle of scorched earth where the stone had vitrified. Of Dr. Elena Rostova, there was no trace, no ashes, no bones. She had collapsed along with her own desire's wave function, absorbed by the universe's blind angles she so longed for. Elias collapsed backward against the roof's low wall, letting the rain wash the blood from his split lip and the cold sweat from his forehead. He began to laugh. It was a broken, hysterical, and painfully human laugh. He had saved the world using chalk, a stolen condenser, and a cursed 19th-century compass, the solitary geometer. 3 weeks later, Vesperia had regained its oppressive monotony. Media attributed the October 24th blackout to a cascading power grid failure from the storm and a gas leak under Meridian Square, explaining the collective hallucinations and temporary amnesia of dozens of the city's prominent figures. Police Chief Vane had been admitted to a high-security psychiatric center, diagnosed with a late schizophrenic outbreak. The world, in its immense and comforting ignorance, continued rotating around an ordinary sun in a predictably 3D space. But Elias Thorne knew the truth. He sat in his small apartment. He drank black coffee before a chalkboard no longer covered in frenetic equations, but containing a single meticulous drawing, a tesseract projection. The immediate threat was neutralized. The epicenter was sealed, and the elite serving as the Pleroma's anchor had been dismantled. The architects were not dead. Such concepts were meaningless to them. They had only been repelled. They had learned Vesperia's membrane had defenses, that human intent could generate repulsive geometry. Elias looked out the window at the industrial alley. A stray cat slipped between trash can shadows. It was an ordinary urban scene, but Elias's eyes could no longer be turned off. He saw the trash can's shadow projecting in a slightly aberrant way. He saw how the building's cornice line across the way seemed to tremble at the limit of his peripheral vision, suggesting an angle that didn't add up to 180 degrees. The hidden skeleton was still there. The universe remained a collection of intransigent solids for most, a comforting prison of up and down, left and right. But the seal Elias created on the clock tower was a tourniquet, not a cure. Vesperia remained a city built on a topological minefield. Places like the theater would remain thin. They were points where the weight of human suffering and desire would rub the reality's surface tension. Elias stood and approached his desk. A new black leather notebook rested there, pages blank. Someone had to watch the angles. Someone had to measure the shadows when the sun was not in the sky. Humanity could not afford the luxury of strict materialism, nor the madness of cosmic devotion. It required a guardian at the border, a ferryman who understood the mathematics of both sides of the river Lethe, but chose every day to stay on the shore of mud, pain, and entropy. He took a pen and opened it. On the first page, with firm calligraphy, he wrote the first law of the new defense topology. Consciousness is the vector, geometry is the vehicle. If angles hide doors from us, we will be the lock. Elias closed the notebook, put on his old wrinkled coat, and left his apartment. He had work to do. An unusual electromagnetic echo had been detected near the abandoned South District docks, and tides were acting irrationally. Descending the stairs toward Vesperia's damp streets, the disgraced topologist knew the geometry of the invisible would never fully vanish. But while he breathed, the monsters would wait. Chapter 7. The Quantum Vacuum and the Fullness of the Spirit. Elias Thorne had believed, with the typical arrogance of exhausted victors, that by neutralizing Dr. Rostova and sealing the clock tower, he had decapitated the hyperdimensional Hydra. Vesperia had survived the Great Alignment. However, 3 weeks after the event, the city did not exhale the relief of a cured patient. Instead, it exhaled the heavy lethargy of an anesthetized body. The perpetual drizzle seemed to have washed the panic from the streets, leaving behind a collective apathy. People walked to their jobs, bought groceries, and stared at their phone screens with a mechanical disconnection. Elias noticed it in the subway and cafes. He saw it in the empty stares of his neighbors. The massive, coherent intent had been shattered, yes, but in its place, the healthy and noisy chaos of normal human life had not remained. A vacuum had been left behind. And in quantum physics, Elias knew better than anyone, the vacuum is never truly empty. He walked through the docks of the South District, an industrial cemetery of rusted cranes that rose like dinosaur skeletons against the leaden sky. The air smelled of saltpeter, rotting seaweed, and spilled diesel. His old coat weighed heavy on his shoulders, and his boots crunched on the cracked asphalt. In his right hand, he held a new detection device. After the melting of the original Valerius plate, Elias had spent weeks building a quantum interference magnetometer, calibrated not to look for peaks of emotional energy, the desire that had attracted the blind architects in the past, but to detect something subtler. He was looking for the drop below the thermodynamic baseline of reality. The earpiece in his ear did not emit the aggressive hum of previous anomalies. It emitted a constant hiss, a white noise reminiscent of the static of an analog television tuned to a dead channel. It was the sound of the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, the diraxy and the pressure of the abyss. As he navigated around abandoned shipping containers, Elias reviewed the theory in his mind. In the early 20th century, Paul Dirac postulated that the vacuum was not absolute nothingness, but an infinite sea of negative energy particles. Later, quantum field theory refined this idea. Empty space is boiling with particles. These virtual particles are born and annihilate each other in fractions of a nanosecond. Although space lacks matter, it possesses a zero-point energy, the lowest possible energy level that a quantum mechanical system can have. Mathematically, this vacuum energy is expressed as the sum of the fundamental states. The infinite summation suggests an inexhaustible pit of energy hidden in the supposed nothingness. And most importantly, this energy exerts pressure. Elias stopped in front of a massive red brick warehouse, number 42. The hiss in his earpiece sharpened slightly. The Casimir effect physically demonstrated this pressure. If you place two perfectly smooth and uncharged metal plates in an absolute vacuum, the pressure of the virtual particles outside the plates will be greater than in the tiny space between them, forcing the plates together with a measurable and real force. Frac Adarum. Elias turned off the detector and removed the earpiece, rubbing his temple. The revelation chilled his blood much more than the geometric monsters of the Athenaeum. The blind architects were entities of pure n-dimensional logic, they learned, seeing that their invasion attempts through human high pressure had been blocked. They had changed strategy. Now they were not trying to force the door by pushing from the outside. They were creating a hyperspatial Casimir effect. They were looking for the voids in Vesperia, human minds that had lost all emotion, all desire, all will. If a human psyche reached the state of absolute vacuum, the total absence of emotional noise, entropy, or attachment would cause the pressure of the three-dimensional reality around them to decrease. Then, the immense pressure of the zero-point energy of the pleroma would simply push inward. It was not an invasion, it was a leak caused by depressurization. The geometry of absence. The corrugated metal door of Warehouse 42 was ajar. Elias turned on his flashlight and entered. The interior was vast, cold, and plunged in twilight. The steel beams of the ceiling formed a framework reminiscent of the interior of a rusted ribcage. There was no machinery, no boxes, no remains of contraband. Only dust accumulated over decades. However, the flashlight beam revealed that the dust did not lie in a uniform and chaotic layer. In the exact center of the immense concrete floor, the dust formed perfect concentric circles, like the rings of a tree, converging toward a central point. There were no footprints. The air currents of the warehouse simply did not affect that area. Elias advanced with extreme slowness. Unlike previous anomalies, where space fractured into colored prisms or emitted extreme cold, here there was no visual spectacle. There was an overwhelming absence of properties. The air was neither cold nor hot. It simply was not felt against the skin. The sound of his own footsteps seemed to muffle as he approached the center, as if space itself was swallowing the kinetic energy of his boots. It was a pocket of zero entropy. And in the exact center of the dust rings, sitting on the floor in a fetal position, was a man. Elias recognized his haggard profile. It was Silas Vance. He had seen his face in local newspapers weeks ago. Silas was a maintenance engineer at St. Lazarus Hospital. The night of the Great Alignment, a localized structural collapse, collateral damage of dimensional friction, had brought down part of a wing. Silas's wife and daughter, who were there visiting a relative, died instantly. Silas did not scream, did not cry, did not sue the hospital. He simply evaporated from his life. Elias illuminated the man's face with the edge of the flashlight beam so as not to blind him. Silas had his eyes open, but his pupils did not react to the light. He was staring at an infinite point on the concrete floor. His breathing was so shallow that his chest barely moved. "Silas," Elias whispered. His own voice sounded pathetically weak, immediately absorbed by the hungry vacuum of the room. "Mr. Vance." The man did not blink. Elias took one more step. Upon crossing the last ring of dust, he felt his eardrums bulge outward. A brutal negative pressure took hold of the space. The anomaly was not around Silas. The anomaly was Silas. His trauma had been so absolute, so unbearably vast, that the engineer's mind had shut down. It had executed a total emergency shutdown protocol. He had emptied his consciousness of all thought, of all pain, of any trace of psychological noise that anchored him to reality. He had become a perfect vacuum, and the pleroma was using him as a sink. Elias looked beyond Silas. The air behind the man was beginning to distort, not with hard angles, but with an oily smoothness. It was like looking through a desert mirage. The three-dimensional space was thinning, yielding to the pressure of the hyperspatial vacuum. If Silas maintained that state long enough, the membrane would tear. It would tear silently. No explosions, no light storms. The warehouse would simply sink into the fourth dimension, and with it, the rest of the South District. The tyranny of materialism. Elias knelt slowly in front of Silas, a meter away. How do you fight nothingness? In the Athenaeum, Elias had fought against excessive intent using topological isolation. But here, isolation was precisely the problem. Silas had become a living Klein bottle, hermetically sealed to the outside world. "Silas, listen to me," Elias said, forcing a tone of empathetic urgency, although he knew that rational words could not pierce a wall of vacuum. "I know why you are here. I know what happened at St. Lazarus." No answer. The oily distortion behind Silas became denser. Elias felt a slight suction force. It was pulling at the lapel of his coat. The hyperspatial Casimir effect was gaining strength. Elias rummaged in his pocket. He took out the cold mathematics and replaced it with raw, dirty, physical reality. He did not take out a topological plate, but a crumpled newspaper clipping he had read weeks ago. In it was a small black and white photograph of the Vance family, smiling on a vacation. "The universe you live in right now is very orderly, Silas," Elias spoke, his voice trembling from the effort to project through the zero entropy field. "Pain is disorder. It is pure entropy. It destroys your mental structures, breaks your routines, burns you inside. I understand why you turned off the machine. I understand why you chose silence." Elias moved the crumpled paper toward Silas's field of vision, letting it fall on the floor, right over the point where the man's dead gaze was fixed. But perfect silence is unnatural in our world. We are thermodynamic creatures. We exist thanks to heat, friction, energy losses. If you renounce the friction of grief, you renounce your existential mass. And there are things, geometric and terrible things out there, that hate disorder. They hate it as much as you hate it right now. They are taking advantage of your artificial peace to erase us all. Silas did not move, but a very slight tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through his lower lip. Elias realized that logic and abstract empathy were not enough. The vacuum is not filled with words, it is filled with raw energy. He needed to introduce a chaotic variable into the closed system of Silas's psyche. He needed to force his emotional wave function to collapse into the painful but necessary state of reality. "You are an engineer, Silas. You know the conservation of energy. Energy is not destroyed, only transformed. All that love you had for your wife and daughter has not evaporated. You have compressed it. You have frozen it until bringing it to absolute zero." Elias leaned forward, breaking the personal space barrier. He grabbed Silas by the shoulders of his frayed jacket. The physical contact was like touching the steel of an industrial refrigerator. "Look at it!" Elias shouted at him, his voice breaking the unnatural silence of the warehouse, injecting decibels of pure human desperation into the equation. "Look at them on the paper. They are dead, Silas. The concrete crushed them because arrogant people played with mathematics they did not understand, and your response is to become one of their static equations. You are opening the door for them." The cruelty of his words tasted like bile in his throat. It was contrary to all his instincts as an empathetic human being, but it was the only topological surgery that would work. He had to hurt to heal. The tremor in Silas's lip spread to his jaw. His eyes, fixed and expressionless for days, blinked. Only once. That simple biological act sparked heat. A micro-spark of heat was generated by a muscle contracting. The hiss in Elias's earpiece changed tone, becoming slightly deeper. The oily mirage behind Silas wavered. "It hurts," Silas whispered. His voice was a crackle of dehydrated vocal cords, a sound barely above a falling leaf. But in that pocket of absolute silence, it sounded like thunder. "I know," Elias said, loosening his grip on the man's shoulders, but without letting go, maintaining the tactile connection. "It has to hurt. Pain is the friction that anchors us to the third dimension. It is proof that you are alive, that you are. It is proof that they existed. Crying is the most beautiful act of entropy in the universe. It wears down the perfect order of the pleroma." Silas slowly lowered his gaze toward the crumpled photograph on the concrete. His lungs took a deep, trembling, and broken breath. It was a wet, chaotic sound full of inevitable human imperfection. And then the engineer broke. The fullness of the spirit. The crying of Silas Vance was not a silent sob. It was a primitive howl, an animal tear that echoed off the corrugated metal walls of the immense Warehouse 42. It was the sound of a dam that finally bursts under the pressure of millions of cubic liters of dark water. Silas fell forward. He rested his forehead on the concrete floor, grabbing the newspaper clipping and squeezing it against his chest, while his entire body convulsed with the force of his grief. Elias stepped back several steps, observing the physics of pain in action. The anomaly could not withstand it. The pure entropy that Silas radiated, the uncontrollable cascade of body heat, acoustic noise, chemical stress reactions, and emotional chaos, was poison for the static perfection of the pleroma. The distortion of space behind the engineer collapsed instantly. It burst in a brief gust of wind that lifted the perfect circles of dust into a swirling and chaotic cloud, returning the warehouse to its natural disorder. The negative pressure in Elias's earpicks vanished suddenly. The air temperature normalized. The quantum vacuum had been filled. It was filled by the fullness, terrible and disordered, of the human spirit. Elias waited in silence for almost half an hour, letting the man pour out the ocean of compressed energy he had been harboring. When Silas's sobs reduced to an exhausted gasp, Elias approached. He took off his coat and placed it on the engineer's trembling shoulders. Silas sat up slowly, his face swollen, dirty with dust and tears. He looked at Elias with deep bewilderment, like someone waking up from a coma of years. "What have I done?" Silas murmured, looking around. "You have returned to thermodynamics, Silas," Elias replied, offering him a hand to help him up. "You have done the bravest thing a human being can do in this universe. You have accepted chaos." He helped the engineer walk toward the warehouse exit. Outside, the drizzle seemed less threatening. It was simply a natural consequence of water vapor condensation, devoid of dark mathematical intentions. While waiting with Silas for the arrival of an ambulance he had called from a nearby public phone, Elias took out his notebook. The war had changed paradigm. Elena Rostova had believed that desire and intent were the only keys. But the universe was a place of balance. The blind architects were opportunists. If they could not enter through the fire of human ambition, they would try to leak through the ice of apathy. Vesperia was a sick city, traumatized by the Great Alignment, although most did not remember the truth of the event. It was full of people like Silas, people teetering on the edge of total emotional blackout. Elias noted on the page, "The wall that protects us is not made of bricks, nor even of formulas. It is made of the disorder of our emotions. Grief, irrational joy, anger, chaotic love. Classical materialism told us we were insignificant biological machines. Valerius told us we were hyperdimensional vectors. Both are wrong. We are generators of entropy, and that is our salvation." He closed the notebook and kept it in the inner pocket of his jacket. The ambulance arrived with its rotating lights, projecting warm and intermittent colors over the puddles of the docks. While the paramedics attended to Silas, Elias walked away alone along the pier. The imminent danger had been repelled, but the work of the solitary geometer was just beginning. He had to learn to read the city in a completely new way, not looking for physical anomalies, but tracking the geological faults of the human heart. He looked at the dark water. The water of the harbor churned against the wooden pilings. The turbulence was beautiful, It was the proof that the universe remained an imperfect and wonderful place. Chapter 8. The Thermodynamics of Belief. Lethargy is, in its essence, a thermodynamic surrender. When the cold becomes unbearable, the human body does not fight. It simply slows its metabolism, closing peripheral capillaries to protect the warm core, until it finally sinks into a sleep from which there is no return. Elias Thorne understood that Vesperia was entering psychological hypothermia. Walking the grey streets 3 weeks after the Great Alignment, he saw the signs. After saving Silas Vance from becoming a quantum sink for the blind architects, Elias hoped the collective trauma would dissipate. He hoped the natural entropy of human life, noisy traffic, cafe arguments, market bustle, would warm the fabric of 3D reality once again. But it did not happen. Elias stopped at the corner of the Avenue of Tears and observed the passers-by. They moved with a macabre synchrony. No one stumbled. No one raised their voice. Faces were empty, devoid of the frenetic anxiety that usually characterized metropolis dwellers. It was the evaporation of free will, more insidious than Rostova's attack. He returned to his apartment, a sanctuary of vital disorder, piles of differential topology books mixed with half-finished coffee cups and leftover copper wires from his improvised detectors. That chaos was his anchor. He stood before the blackboard. He erased the calculations on zero-point energy and watched the white dust fall to the floor. Why wasn't Vesperia healing? Clinical apathy at this scale should present statistical variations. Some individuals should show anger, others denial, others hyperactivity. But the emotion distribution curve had flattened unnaturally. There was an underlying order in this sadness. In physics, order is never free, it always requires work. The equation of rigid faith. Elias picked up a clean piece of chalk. If raw emotion, Silas's crying, fear, love, was high entropy, a disordered system that generated friction and kept pleroma entities at bay, what was the opposite? What was a perfectly ordered mind? The answer hit him with the force of an undeniable axiom: belief, not hope, but absolute rigid certainty. When a mind believes in an absolute dogma, its micropsychological states are reduced. Uncertainty vanishes. Elias traced Boltzmann's equation for entropy, adapting it to the human psyche interacting with dimensional topology. Simanta diwan ext ardiu kb rln omega ext deon, where omega de $6 was the number of accessible microstates. In a healthy mind, omega dollar is astronomically large, but if something imposed an absolute unifying belief, a signal convincing inhabitants that all effort was futile, then omega dollars would tend toward 1. Mental entropy would drop to 0, minds would become perfect crystals of stasis. As Silas Vance had taught him, the pleroma loves the vacuum. A crystal without entropy generates no friction. It is a transparent window through which the blind architects can look and eventually pass. Elias stepped back, heart racing. Vesperia's apathy was terraforming. A new enemy was cooling the population for the next spatial fold: the frequency of nihilism. He needed proof. The quantum magnetometer was too local. To measure a city-level glaciation, he needed the full electromagnetic spectrum. Elias spent 48 hours without sleep, fueled by black coffee and the adrenaline of discovery. He cannibalized an old CRT oscilloscope and programmed a Fourier transform algorithm to isolate order. If someone was emitting this freezing belief, the signal would sound like pure mathematics. At 3 in the morning on Tuesday, the oscilloscope finally stabilized. Amidst radio noise and city static, a green line appeared. It was not a natural sine wave. It was a perfect square wave, lacking any harmonic noise, information defying thermodynamics. Elias connected studio headphones to the audio output. He wanted to hear the wave's shape. Putting them on, he heard silence. But not the absence of sound, an active, heavy silence. A sound designed to cancel autonomous thought frequencies. Elias felt a wave of instant fatigue. A voice whispered to give up, that his math was a farce. He tore off the headphones, gasping for breath. The experiment was a terrifying success. The signal existed. It was psychological background radiation, a sub-auditory frequency of mathematical hopelessness bathing Vesperia 24 hours a day. Elias calibrated the directional antenna to triangulate the source. The needle fixed west. Toward the Iron Hills, there stood the antenna of Whispers. The cemetery of waves, the antenna of Whispers, was a Cold War relic, a 300-meter steel lattice tower built at the highest point of the municipal cemetery. Officially decommissioned in the 90s, it still rose over the tombstones, like a rusty needle pointing at a sick sky. Elias drove through the rain to the cemetery gates, a sea of eroded marble. The massive steel tower rose in the center, its thick guy wires disappearing into the fog like an industrial arachnid's webs. He turned off the engine. The meter marked the maximum. The square wave source was exactly above. He left the car, hiding a butane torch and a steel crowbar under his coat. The air here felt like honey about to crystallize. Local entropy was so low that moving muscles required Herculean effort. He walked among the graves, the signal crushing his will. "Go home," the topology whispered. "Surrender. All dust returns to dust." "Thermodynamics requires friction," Elias forced himself to say aloud, using his voice as a shield. "We exist because we are imperfect." He reached the base. The control building, a windowless concrete square, was surrounded by a recently cut barbed wire fence. Elias slipped through. The heavy armored door was ajar, emitting a faint pulsing blue glow from within. He readied the crowbar and pushed. The interior was not abandoned. Modern server racks filled the room. The air was freezing despite the processes. Thermal energy was being drained and transmuted. In the center, connected to the main coaxial cable, was a structure Elias recognized with a knot in his stomach. It was not a human artifact. It was a solid fragment of the pleroma. The engine of certainty. It was a geodesic sphere the size of a small car, made of planes of black light. An optical contradiction absorbing photons and returning sharp angles. It rotated on multiple axes, shrinking and expanding like a mechanical heart. Around it, 6 people knelt on the bare concrete floor. They were connected by thick needles driven into their skulls. Cables ran from the needles to the sphere's surface. Elias stifled a cry of horror. Rostova had used fanaticism. Whoever built this had refined the process. They captured broken people and used their absolute apathy as a battery. The black sphere amplified their nihilism and injected it through the antenna to brainwash the city's topology. "Fascinating, isn't it, Professor Thorne?" Elias spun around, raising his crowbar. From the shadows emerged a man in an impeccable suit, wearing round-rimmed glasses. He looked like a corporate bureaucrat. "The syndicate has been watching you since the clock tower," he said in a calm voice. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am the censor." "You're using humans as entropy filters," Elias growled. "You're killing Vesperia's free will." The censor smiled. "Free will is a byproduct of neurological disorder, Elias. It causes suffering." Rostova was naive. "We in the syndicate of stasis are pragmatics. The pleroma isn't heaven. It is simply a refrigerator. We are providing stillness." The censor pointed to the sphere. "The blind architects crave quiet. We are giving it to them without violent tears. We are reducing Vesperia's emotional variance to 0. At psychological absolute 0, we will merge with the pleroma with a perfect phase transition. No one will feel anything. Absolute peace." "It's the peace of the dead," Elias replied. "A matter of thermodynamic perspective," the censor said. "Join us. You know life's heat is destined to dissipate. We are just accelerating the process elegantly." Elias looked at the generators on the floor, the cables draining their autonomy. He felt the sphere's power nullifying hope. Then he remembered the sound of Silas Vance's crying. That chaotic, painful, immensely human sob had shattered the perfect vacuum. Static perfection was beautiful math, but Elias was a dweller of the world of mud. Mud required friction. "Your equations are incomplete, censor," Elias whispered. "What variable are we missing?" the censor asked. "The principle of conservation of uncertainty." Elias raised the torch and the crowbar. The censor looked disappointed. "Don't be absurd. The sphere is a topological crystal. It cannot be broken by brute force. I'm not going to break the sphere, Elias said, eyes fixed on the main coaxial cable joining the artifact to the human tower. I'm going to break the antenna. With a cry, Elias ran toward the server's back panel. The sensor pulled a silenced firearm, but Elias was faster, fueled by entropic adrenaline. He slammed the crowbar against the solid copper junction. The metal groaned. A spark jumped. The sensor fired, grazing Elias's shoulder, tearing his coat and skin. Elias ignored the pain. He clicked the torch. The blue flame, burning at over 1,000 degrees, licked the fractured cable. He wasn't attacking pleroma geometry. He was attacking the Syndicate's 3D infrastructure. By applying extreme heat to a damaged junction, he violently altered the cable's electrical resistance. Radio frequency equations broke. The impedance changed instantly, creating a massive standing wave recoil. The black sphere's static energy could no longer climb the antenna. It bounced off the flame and was forced back into the artifact. The geodesic sphere let out an acoustic howl that shouldn't exist. Blocked energy overloaded its links to our plane. Planes of black light fragmented. The needles were ejected from the prisoners' necks with a sharp sound. The 6 individuals collapsed, unconscious but freed. The sensor was thrown against the racks by the shockwave. His form oscillated between dimensions, unable to maintain a stable geometry. Elias didn't wait to see more. He grabbed the nearest prisoner and staggered out into the freezing rain. Behind him, ultraviolet light flashed, followed by the sound of concrete imploding. The server room folded into a quantum tear and vanished, taking the sphere and the sensor back to the dark angles of the pleroma. The thermodynamic resistance. Elias sat against a marble tomb, pressing his bleeding shoulder. The rescued man coughed on the wet grass, filling his lungs with painful, real air. He looked at the antenna. The steel lattice stood, but the crushing weight of imposed belief was gone. The cemetery air felt mournful and damp again, not mathematically sterile. But victory tasted bitter. The Syndicate sought perfect thermodynamic suicide using Vesperia's infrastructure. If the sensor existed, there were others, vacuum engineers building engines of certainty. Destroying one antenna was like pulling a weed in an infinite field. He looked at the rescued man, regaining 3D sensitivity. The answer wasn't just in equations. A single mind could not win against a systemic force using citizens as vacuum batteries. To fight absolute order, he needed to inject massive heat into the system. He needed friction, noise, and entropy. Elias smiled, despite the pain. Silas had been the first experiment. Now he knew what to do. He couldn't fight as a lone mathematician. He had to become a catalyst of passions. He had to gather the broken, those who survived the edge of the hyperspatial void. Silas, this stranger, and others drained by the Syndicate. If he taught them to reconnect with pain, rage, and love, they would build a wall of fire. A thermodynamic fire to burn the blind architects before they crossed the threshold. The geometry of the invisible had been discovered. Now it was time to found the thermodynamics of the resistance. Chapter 9, Biophysics of Conviction. Elias Thorne's apartment smelled of copper, old sweat, and iodine. It was the unmistakable scent of biology in distress, a sharp and pestilent reminder that human life is a messy process. And for the first time in months, Elias found that smell deeply comforting. It was real. 48 hours had passed since the assault on the antenna of Whispers. Elias sat at the kitchen table, his left arm immobilized in an improvised sling after having extracted the sensor's bullet fragments himself with fire-sterilized tweezers. The pain was a constant burning pulse in his deltoid, a meat metronome. On the dilapidated living room sofa rested Arthur Penhaligon. That was the name given by the man they rescued from the cemetery in his sparse moments of lucidity. Arthur trembled under 3 heavy wool blankets, trapped in the aftermath of being used as a stasis battery for the Syndicate. His body was here, but his nerves were gone. At the foot of the sofa, Silas Vance boiled water on a portable stove. The engineer from St. Lazarus, the man who had nearly collapsed Vesperia with his own emotional void, now moved with a deliberate and earthly purpose. Silas had become the apartment's anchor. He provided the stability needed for the transition. "His body temperature is still fluctuating," Silas reported, pouring hot water into a cup with black tea leaves. "It dropped to 35 degrees half an hour ago, and now he's sweating. His body doesn't know how to regulate itself without that people's machine." The absence of the machine left a biological vacuum. "The syndicate imposed a perfect symmetry on him," Elias responded, slowly approaching his blackboard, shuffling his feet from exhaustion. "And biology hates perfect symmetry. A perfectly regular EKG without variability is the symptom preceding a heart attack. Life requires noise. Arthur is experiencing void withdrawal. His brain has to relearn how to generate friction." Elias took a piece of chalk with his right hand, the only one that worked, and looked at the black surface. The war had changed scale. It was no longer about building topological gadgets with stolen capacitors to isolate entire buildings. It was about human nature. Dr. Rostova had tried to force the membrane with a massive needle of coherent intent. The syndicate of stasis was trying to freeze the water so that the membrane would crack on its own. The defense, therefore, could not be purely inorganic. If the battlefield was free will, topology had to integrate with neurochemistry. "The bioenergetic tensor, biophysics of conviction," Elias wrote at the top of the blackboard. If the pleroma and its blind architects were repelled by high entropy, the chaos, heat, and disorder of human emotions, Elias needed a way to measure and direct that energy. Until now, Silas's crying had been an accidental explosion of raw pain. It was a dirty bomb of grief that had collapsed an incipient fold, but they could not depend on accidental explosions. They needed to turn emotion into a directed charge. Elias began to formulate a new model. Einstein's general relativity established that mass and energy curved space-time, expressed by the tensor T-dolus. But Elias introduced a quantum biological perturbation, a tensor representing the flux density of human neurochemical chaos. G dars plus I lambda, G, vida efrak al left, T plus Namathkal, eit. In his equation, Tamathkalis was the weapon. It represented the topological weight of a mind in a state of high agitation. When a human experienced a spike in cortisol, adrenaline, and disordered synaptic activity, pure fear, furious love, searing grief, it generated a localized interference field that turned the surrounding space rough and unstable for the pleroma. "Silas!" Elias called out, without taking his eyes off the numbers. "Do you remember what you felt in Warehouse 42? At the exact moment you saw the photo and started to cry." Silas left the teacup on the table and stared at his own hands, calloused by hard work. He remembered the exact sensation of the break. "I felt like I was breaking. Before that, there was nothing. It was like floating in a dark ocean without currents. I wasn't cold or hot. But when I looked at the paper, it was as if I swallowed a handful of ground glass. I felt heat, a suffocating heat in my chest, and a noise in my head that wouldn't let me think." "That ground glass is what will save us," Elias murmured. "It is entropic friction. The syndicate sphere we destroyed in the cemetery operated by smoothing space, eliminating those thermal currents from your mind. Arthur was emptied by that machine. We have to teach him how to burn again." He had to feel. A sharp groan interrupted the physics lesson. Arthur writhed on the sofa, clutching his head with both hands. His eyes snapped open, but they were not looking at Elias's living room. They were dilated, reflecting the mute horror of someone peering into an infinite abyss. "There are no corners," Arthur stammered. "It's all smooth. It slips. I can't hold on." Silas approached quickly and put a firm hand on his shoulder. Arthur screamed and tried to pull away, as if the physical contact burned him. "Let me go. The silence is better. Let me fall." He begged for the void he had just escaped from. "I'm not going to let you fall, boy," Silas said, his voice deep and resonant, devoid of a doctor's condescending pity, loaded instead with the brutal empathy of a trenchmate. "You're looking for walls in a place that has no end. You have to stop looking outside. Look inside." He forced the man to center himself. "There is nothing inside," Arthur sobbed, scratching his chest through his dirty shirt. "They took it all out through the back of my neck." Elias approached, holding his injured arm. "They didn't take your memories, Arthur. They only froze the neurotransmitters that give them weight. They induced emotional superconductivity. The pain passed through you without resistance, feeding their machine. You have to create resistance again." Elias took one of the old burnt capacitors from the table, a scorched and heavy metal cylinder, and threw it into Arthur's lap. The metallic weight hit the man's thighs, making him jump. It was a physical anchor. "Feel that," Elias ordered. "It weighs 2 kilos. It's iron, copper, and carbon. It's dense, stupid, and wonderfully real. It's not a tesseract. It's not an infinite dimension. It's a piece of 3-dimensional junk. Hold on to it." Arthur wrapped his trembling hands around the burnt capacitor. The contact with the rough texture and the coldness of the metal seemed to anchor his erratic eyes. His breathing became less shallow. "Now I want you to remember what you lost," Silas said, kneeling beside him. "Not what they did to you. What you were before the syndicate found you. Tell me what hurts." Arthur grit his teeth. Tears began to form in the corners of his eyes, not of relief, but of a purifying agony. "My dog. A damn deaf terrier. I left him locked in the kitchen when they snatched me off the street. It's been weeks. Helby." He couldn't finish the sentence as the realization hit him. "Feel that guilt," Elias interrupted him, relentless, observing how the room's temperature seemed to rise a fraction of a degree, how the air lost that residual static tension of the pleroma that Arthur had brought with him. "Guilt is one of the most entropic forces in the universe. Use it. Burn with it." Arthur burst into tears, clinging to the piece of metal as if it were a life preserver. The room filled with the messy, human sound of his anguish. Elias and Silas exchanged a look of deep understanding. The patient had been stabilized. The generator had been turned on again. The defense was forming. Stochastic resonance. During the following week, Elias's apartment stopped being a simple refuge and became a dojo for asymmetric psychological warfare. Elias understood he couldn't just throw traumatized people at the syndicate and expect their pain to be enough. A directionless explosion doesn't destroy a bunker, it just makes noise. He needed to teach them what is known in signal theory as stochastic resonance, the phenomenon where a signal too weak to be detected can be amplified and optimized by adding white noise or chaos to the system. They had to learn how to weaponize their own internal disorder against the enemy. In topological terms, Silas and Arthur had to learn to invoke their worst traumas and rawest emotions, not to sink into them, but to project them outward as an electromagnetic interference field. They had to learn to scream mathematically. Elias built small inverted topology oscillators from scraps of the plate. They were the size of a coin. He asked Silas and Arthur to hold them in their hands. "These discs are calibrated to attract the vacuum frequencies of the pleroma," Elias explained, walking in front of them as both sat with closed eyes, sweating from concentration. "If you let your minds flatten, you freeze. If you fall into apathy, the disc will cool until it burns your skin with frostbite. Your task is to keep the disc warm. Your task is to keep the mind so chaotic, so noisy with memories and intensity, that the pleroma cannot grab hold of you." It was a brutal training of the soul and the mind. Silas relived the hospital collapse hundreds of times, learning not to succumb to catatonia, but to transform the image of concrete falling on his family into a boiling fury, into an active thermodynamic rejection. Arthur used the desperation of his captivity, transforming the needles into an aggressive terror. It was a panic that didn't paralyze, but burned calories and curved the space around him. After 10 days, Elias put them to the final test. He turned off all the lights and turned on the square wave generator he had confiscated from the cemetery, emitting the sensor's signal at low power in the living room. Gravity seemed to increase. The heaviness of nihilism flooded the room, whispering surrender into their ear canals. Silas and Arthur did not move. Instead of yielding to lethargy, Elias saw through his modified spectrum goggles how the bodies of both men began to radiate massive infrared heat halos. Their pulses rose, their trained minds reacted to the signal of perfect order by vomiting controlled psychological chaos. The room temperature rose 3 degrees in 5 minutes. The syndicate's signal fragmented, unable to propagate through the dense fog of biological friction both were generating. They had forged the weapon. They were literally entropy generators, Vesperia's data nexus. While training his burgeoning infantry, Elias also tracked. Using his improved equipment, he looked for cold holes in Vesperia's infrastructure, places where electricity consumption and human activity were high, but the psychological entropy footprint was abnormally low. These were the targets. The syndicate needed automated, repetitive places where the human mind was already preconditioned to function as a machine, to install their pleroma nodes without raising suspicion. He found it on a Thursday night, the Vesperia Automated Exchange Nexus, a giant, windowless building. In the heart of the financial district, thousands of servers executed high-frequency stock trades guided by pure algorithms. Hundreds of analysts worked there, but their labor was of a crushing monotony, monitoring screens, verifying green lights, not feeling, not desiring, only optimizing efficiency. It was the perfect thermodynamic sink. A place of strict mathematical rules where the syndicate could install another stasis battery to keep freezing the city from the shadows. At 1 in the morning, under Vesperia's usual shroud of grey rain, the trio arrived at the building's back alley. Elias was dressed in his long coat, hiding a crowbar and a new portable disruptor. Silas, burly and silent, carried a heavy pipe wrench. Arthur, despite being visibly pale, refused to be left behind. His eyes shone with a feverish determination. He was no longer a victim. He was a bomb. "The stasis field is dense here," Elias whispered, looking at the quantum meter on his wrist, whose needle trembled dangerously toward zero. "The syndicate must have at least another geodesic sphere or something worse operating inside. Remember the training. Keep the noise high." They moved in. Silas nodded. He picked the electronic lock of the service door with a homemade magnetic tool. The bolt yielded with a dull click. The interior of the Nexus was not dark. It was lit by a white, clinical, shadowless light projected by thousands of LED fluorescents aligned with paralyzing symmetry. The sound of server cooling fans was a monotonous hum, an industrial mantra designed to hypnotize. They advanced through hallways flanked by walls of flickering processors. There were no conventional armed security guards. They didn't need them. The field itself was the security measure. As they moved into the building's core, Elias felt the pressure increase. It was like walking submerged in a tank of mercury. The geometry of the hallways began to feel wrong. The halls seemed too long for the building's exterior dimensions. Angles that should be 90 degrees caused vertigo. They suggested imperceptible but nauseating hyperbolic tilts. They reached the main operations room, a vaulted cavern in the center of the facility. What they found there made Elias's breath catch. It was a nightmare of crystal. It was a massive crystalline structure suspended from the ceiling. It seemed to be growing like a bismuth mushroom. It was composed of opaque light fractals multiplying over themselves. It didn't emit the square wave the sensor used. It emitted a smoothness field that flattened local space-time. Under the structure, dozens of Nexus employees stood motionless. They didn't have needles in their necks. They were in a state of deep somnambulism, staring at the fractal structure. Their lethargy, their daily algorithmic routine, had been amplified until they became a matrix of biological servers. The syndicate was extracting what little chaos they had left. They used their inertia to feed the pleroma's intrusion. In front of the crowd of somnambulists, orchestrating the silence, were 2 individuals in the same impeccable suits as the sensor. They were not charismatic leaders like Elena Rostova. They were vacuum technicians, engineers of nothingness. One of them noticed the intrusion. He turned his head. His eyes behind the glasses were pits of absolute stillness. "A thermodynamic anomaly," the syndicate technician said. His voice didn't resonate. It simply deposited in the air, lacking echo. "Elias Thorne. The system predicted a 12% probability. It predicted you would survive the cemetery collapse and seek another node. However, your presence is irrelevant. The local stasis constant is too high for your topology. The technician raised a hand, tracing a 5-dimensional figure in the air. He was initiating a shutdown sequence. Instantly, the fractal structure above them pulsed. A cold pressure wave swept the room. Elias felt the portable disruptor in his hands turn into a useless block of ice. His knees failed. An infinite weariness, the crushing weight of 100 lives of futility, collapsed upon his mind. The mathematics sustaining his will began to unravel. What was the point of fighting against infinity? Why not simply lie on the impeccable tiled floor and allow the universe to fold into a silent and painless peace? Elias fell to his knees, dropping the device. Arthur also staggered. He was covering his ears and sobbing silently. "Entropy always decays, Professor," the syndicate technician murmured, slowly approaching them, like a gravedigger admiring clean work. "You are just a heat spike on a graph tending toward zero. It is time for the asymptote." The end was certain. The ignition. "Arthur!" The cry didn't come from Elias, but from Silas Vance. Silas was still standing. His muscles were tense to the limit, the veins in his neck bulging. His face was flushed, pearled with profuse and burning sweat. He was using every ounce of his training. He was the resistance. The engineer took a step forward, his boots echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Arthur, remember the dog!" Silas roared, ignoring the technician in the suit and addressing the broken man beside him. "Remember the cold of that room. Don't let them turn off the light again." Elias, fighting the fog in his own mind, watched fascinated. Silas wasn't formulating equations. He was applying pure and raw Hamathkal. He was projecting a massive wave of thermal indignation and psychological disorder. Arthur looked up. His face, once pale with defeat, contorted into a mask. It was a mask of pure animal rage. He had been emptied once. He refused to let them do it again. With a guttural howl, a torn and cacophonous scream that defied all the building's pre-calculated acoustics, Arthur charged forward. He became the catalyst for the entire room's awakening. He didn't attack the syndicate technician. He ran directly toward the mass of somnambulant office workers, acting as a battery for the fractal. Crashing into them, pushing and grabbing, Arthur injected the virus of chaos into the ordered system. "Wake up!" Arthur screamed, shaking an analyst. He was transferring the heat of his own panic, of his own living pain. Silas joined him, pushing the syndicate technician away with a violent physical shove, raw kinetic force against a being operating in hyperspatial geometry. Silas began overturning workstations, smashing screens. He threw servers to the floor with a gloriously noisy and entropic metallic crash. The Nexus's static perfection began to crumble. The office workers, violently shaken from their lethargy by aggressive physical contact, deafening noise, and the pure magnetic force of emotional chaos, woke up. They murmured, confused. Then they felt the unnatural cold and began to get scared. Fear, beautiful and unpredictable fear, flooded the room. Elias felt the lethargic weight lift from his mind as local entropy soared. He stood up. The battle for the Nexus had turned in their favor. The fractal structure on the ceiling began to vibrate erratically. As the room filled with unpredictable psychological variables, uncontrolled human heat, and acoustic noise, the n-dimensional geometry lost its footing. It could not process the dense chaos of dozens of people in simultaneous panic. The syndicate technicians backed away, losing their perfect contours. The laws of three-dimensional physics, rearmed by the biological heat of those present, violently reasserted themselves in the room. "The phase collapse," one of the technicians cried, his voice cracking with terror. He was terrified at the incompressibility of human disorder. Elias grabbed his wrench and ran to the server's central cooling panel, smashing the liquid coolant lines with a well-aimed blow. A pressurized jet of white gas hissed, adding another layer of thermodynamic chaos. The breach activated the fire alarms and the sprinklers. Cold water began to pour down inside the Nexus, soaking the office workers, causing screams, slips, and massive short circuits. It was absolute pandemonium. It was life, reclaiming its territory. The mushroom was dying. The bismuth fractal on the ceiling couldn't sustain the mathematical contradiction. The biological noise in the energy momentum tensor was too massive. With a dull crack, the structure collapsed, not inward in a clean fold, but exploding into a rain of harmless ash that dissolved. The syndicate technicians didn't disappear dramatically. Simply, deprived of their anchor in the void, they collapsed on the floor, writhing as their nihilistic minds were flooded by the raw, overwhelming, and insufferable entropy of the real world. They were temporarily driven mad by overload. The army of disorder. Outside, police and fire truck sirens tore through Vesperia's damp night. Elias, Silas, and Arthur walked at a brisk pace through a distant alley, soaked to the bone and gasping, camouflaged by the shadows and the downpour. Arthur limped, but there was a wild, fierce, and painful smile on his face. His eyes were no longer empty. They shone with the fire of revenge. "It works," Silas said, resting a heavy and warm hand on Elias's uninjured shoulder. "Your damn stochastic math works." Elias looked at the two men. They were not soldiers. They were victims of trauma. They were broken people Vesperia's society would have preferred to marginalize or drug into stillness. But in the new physics of conflict, their wounds were their weapons. They were the anomalies the syndicate could not calculate. The syndicate of stasis had the precision of the vacuum. They possessed clean equations and perfect geometries. They sought to silence the universe to please the blind architects. But Elias Thorne was no longer a frightened topologist fleeing blind angles. He stopped under a flickering street lamp and pulled out his crumpled notebook. Under the rain blurring the ink, he looked at his burgeoning and disordered army of thermodynamic resistance. Vesperia was still plagued with syndicate nodes. The city's spiritual glaciation had only just begun to recede. But now, they knew how to start the fire. Elias closed the notebook. He nodded toward the darkness of the metropolis. "Let's go," Elias said, his voice loaded with the vibrant and noisy physics of human conviction. "We have an entire city to wake up, and we're going to make a hell of a lot of noise." Chapter 10. The Final Equation, The Leap to Knowledge. Resistance is not a state of grace. It is a controlled hemorrhage. 6 months after the fall of the exchange nexus, Vesperia had become a schizophrenic city, divided between pockets of intense, noisy human vitality and craters of absolute silence, where the Stasis Syndicate still operated in the shadows. It was a war of nerves. Elias Thorne had aged 10 years in half a year. His apartment, once a refuge for theoretical topology, was now the command center for the thermodynamics of resistance. Dozens of cables crossed the ceiling, connecting oscilloscopes, sensors, and 3D maps. Around him, an army of broken people, led by Silas Vance, formed the first line of defense. They were the generators, trauma survivors who had learned to use their pain as a thermal shield against the quantum vacuum. But Elias knew they were losing the war of attrition. They could destroy stasis spheres and wake the sleepwalkers, but the Syndicate did not need sleep. The blind architects had the patience of the infinite. Worse still, classical thermodynamics dictated that human resistance was unsustainable in the long term. "We cannot keep screaming forever," Elias murmured, leaning over the central table, watching red lights flicker on the map of Vesperia. The lights represented areas where the emotional temperature was falling near psychological absolute zero. Silas, wiping grease from a heavy wrench, looked up. "We have reclaimed the South District. We have disconnected hundreds of people. They are bleeding, Elias. The Syndicate is retreating." "They are not retreating, Silas. They are condensing." Elias rubbed his bloodshot eyes. He knew the enemy was refining their topological strategy. At first, they tried to force the membrane with the gravity of desire thanks to Rostova. Then they tried to freeze the city with nihilistic white noise. They failed because we used biological chaos to break their perfect geometries. But they are learning. Elias moved to the blackboard. It was covered in calculations on the Baconstein bound. "If we keep generating pure chaos," Elias explained, taking a piece of chalk, "we are approaching thermal death by exhaustion." Chaos is disordered energy. It is like lighting fires to drive away winter. Eventually, you run out of wood. The syndicate realizes this. They are building a thermodynamic singularity. He wrote the inequality. This equation tells us that the maximum entropy, stall, is limited by radius $, and energy $. The syndicate is compressing its stasis field. They are creating a macroscopic Bose-Einstein condensate, a state where all particles fall to the same minimum quantum state, acting as a single superatom without friction, a sharp needle. Arthur, leaning in the doorway with arms crossed, frowned. And where are they building that needle? Elias traced a red circle at the geographic center of Vesperia's vital supplies. At the Great Lethe Reservoir, water is the city's greatest natural heat sink. If they freeze the reservoir at a subatomic level, they will win. The thermodynamic leap of faith. The storm lashing Vesperia that night was not rain, but hail. Small ice projectiles hit the windshield of the industrial van. Silas drove toward the reservoir on the outskirts. In the back, 12 resistance members prepared in silence. They carried thermal noise generators, adrenaline patches, and the ready scars of their own traumas. Elias sat in the passenger seat, holding something that had taken 3 months to build. It was no longer a simple metal disc or a stolen capacitor. It was a probability engine, a copper and graphene octahedron encapsulated in vacuum glass, designed to project human intent not as chaos, but as something far superior. Meaning. You said white noise is no longer enough, Silas said, eyes on the slippery road. If we can't just scream at them with pain and rage to break their order, what are we going to do tonight, Elias? Elias looked at the octahedron in his hands. Chaos creates disorder, Silas, but the universe is more than entropy. There is an anomaly. It's the creation of information. Think of a piano, Elias explained, his voice vibrating with the intensity of a long, incubated revelation. If you hit all the keys at once, you create deafening white noise. That's the chaos we've been using. It's pure entropy. But if you play the keys in a specific order, it becomes a sonata. Elias turned to look at the men and women in the back. A sonata has immense informational entropy. It is complex and unpredictable, but it has intrinsic order. It has meaning. The blind architects hate chaos, but what they cannot tolerate, what will destroy them, is structured chaos. Beauty, meaning born from pain. Let's teach them. The macroscopic condensate. The Great Lethe Reservoir was a titanic work of early 20th century engineering. A massive concrete dome housing millions of liters of fresh water surrounded by steel catwalks. When the van broke the security barrier, no alarms sounded. The air was already cold enough to freeze breath in the lungs. Hail had turned to unnatural snow. The team stepped out. Gravity was oppressive. Every step toward the heavy steel doors required the will to push a boulder uphill. Silas and Arthur led the way, radiating all the emotional heat they could generate. Their faces were flushed from the effort of keeping the fire lit, protecting the vanguard from psychological icing. They forced the doors and entered the main cavern. The interior was a vision of thermodynamic doomsday. The water was a solid black mirror in a state of perfect quantum stasis. Suspended over the center floated the sensor. His body had lost nearly all traces of 3D humanity. He was surrounded by rings of ultraviolet light. Dozens of syndicate members, connected by neural cables to the pipe network, formed a human mandala, giving their minds to maintain absolute zero. The sensor opened his eyes. They were 2 pure voids, bottomless gravitational pits. You are late, Professor Thorne. The needle is sharp. The cold cut through Elias's entropy field. The probability engine in his hands began to vibrate. The needle will break, Sensor. You are trying to impose a singularity on an expanding universe. This universe is a calculation error. The sensor's voice manifested directly in Elias's cortex, heavy as lead. Join the stillness. Stop fighting perfection. The sensor raised both hands. The ultraviolet rings accelerated, merging into a single point of dazzling light that began to descend toward the black ice. It was the spark that would trigger the chain freezing of Vesperia. Elias felt the membrane of reality thinning to the point of no return. "Now, Silas!" Elias shouted. The final equation. The 12 generators deployed across the catwalks surrounding the reservoir. Silas and Arthur took the main nodes. Following months of torturous training, they did not burst into uncontrolled chaos. They synchronized their pain. Silas projected the loss of his family. Arthur projected the paralyzing terror of his captivity. The others added their own abysses: loneliness, betrayal, visceral fear. Under the direction of Elias, acting as the conductor of this orchestra of scars, they modulated their emissions. Elias turned on the probability engine. The graphene core began to rotate, weaving the entropy waves into a complex mathematical structure. Elias walked to the edge of the black ice. He needed to face pleroma physics with the last great truth of quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He wrote the equation with mind and heat directly onto the perfect flat surface of the stasis field. Tar delta, xr delta, p ageq, nifractar. The universe forbids absolute certainty, Sensor, Elias spoke, his voice amplified by the octahedron, breaking the unnatural silence. You cannot know the position and momentum of a particle simultaneously, and you cannot fix the human mind in a single state without it exploding. He injected the human sonata into the system. The probability engine fired a pulse of warm, golden light that hit the quantum ice. It was an injection of information. Elias was projecting the sum total of his team's human experience directly into the minds of the blind architects. He showed them Silas remembering his daughter's smile. He showed them love. Love, topologically speaking, is the most incomprehensible anomaly for a static higher-dimensional being. It is a link of macrological quantum entanglement that defies distance, time, and logic. The golden light spread across the reservoir, tracing fractals of dazzling, chaotic beauty. The sensor began to tremble. "Incongruity!" the entity screamed, losing its absolute calm. "Irrational variables detected. Information exceeds tensor capacity." "It's life, damn it!" Silas roared from the catwalk, scalding tears sliding down his cheeks, injecting more energy. "It hurts, and it's ours!" The frozen structure began to groan under the pressure. The leap to knowledge. The stasis singularity stopped inches from the ice. The blind architects, peering from the edge of the pleroma, received the full impact of the human sonata. For entities that experience time as static geography, experiencing the arrow of time through human pain and love was a cognitive catastrophe. They were blinded. They understood, in a fraction of a millisecond, the tragedy of loss and the ecstasy of ephemeral creation. The perfection of their n-dimensional calculations was infected by the virus of empathy. Space-time within the dome began to warp. The zero-point energy pressure inverted. The reservoir became a geyser of repulsion. The syndicate mandala was violently disconnected, their bodies collapsing as their minds were overloaded by raw human emotions. The sensor screamed, a sound of digital distortion and breaking bone. His body began to fray into ribbons of darkness and light, dragged into the collapsing singularity. The void was closing. "Elias!" Arthur shouted over the deafening roar of the black ice cracking, turning back into turbulent liquid water. Elias stood at the edge, the engine burning in his hands. In the last seconds, Elias's mind took the leap. His consciousness brushed the pleroma. For an eternal instant, he saw the architects as prisoners. They were immutable beings, trapped in a 4D mathematical ice block, watching with envy the 3D creatures who had the power to change, to burn, and to die. Elias felt an overwhelming compassion. "Punctum est initium et finis," Elias whispered. "The point is the beginning and the end, but the line between them is what matters." With a brutal movement, Elias smashed the probability engine against the concrete floor. The glass and graphene device exploded, releasing all accumulated entropy in a single thermodynamic shockwave. The singularity collapsed. The sensor was absorbed in a flash of Hawking radiation. The air imploded with a massive thunder. Then, only the sound of cold water hitting the dome walls remained, free, liquid, and chaotic. The Liminal City. 3 days later, spring seemed to hit Vesperia all at once. The sun cut through the perpetual grey clouds for the first time in months, warming the wet asphalt. People in the streets walked with renewed vigour, unaware of the cosmic war fought in their reservoirs. The beautiful, noisy friction of life had returned. Elias Thorne sat on a bench in Reason Park, near the Athenaeum, where it all began. He held a paper talking about the miraculous recovery of the city's water supply. Silas sat beside him. They've started dismantling the automated exchange nexus. Shareholders say the algorithms became irrational, Silas commented softly. Elias smiled. Injecting empathetic entropy has unpredictable consequences. I'm glad Arthur was there to kick that server. Silas looked at children running on the grass. Is it over, Elias? Have we sealed the door? Elias took a sip of coffee, feeling the pleasant heat. He looked at the shadows. They were Euclidean again. You can't seal a quantum universe, Silas. There will always be fluctuations. The blind architects will still be there, trying to find a crack in our armor of disorder. Elias turned to his friend. But now they know we are not just prey. We terrified them. Vesperia will always be liminal, a border for the fire. Elias stood up and looked toward the bright horizon. The fear of the early days had transmuted into a profound respect for the biophysics of conviction. The supreme weapon of the multiverse was not a hyperspace equation. It was the stubborn, painful, and glowing human heart. He was ready for the next challenge. Come, Elias said to Silas, adjusting his coat collar under the warm sun. Arthur found a bar in the South District where the coffee machine makes an infernal noise. I think I'm in the mood for an excess of entropy today. They walked into the crowd, two sentinels of the imperfect, leaving the silence behind. Conclusion: the conscious observer in a participatory universe. Classical physics spent centuries trying to excise the observer from the equation. It sought an objective universe, a cosmic clockwork operating in the cold vacuum with or without witnesses. However, Elias Thorne had discovered in Vesperia's geometric abysses that reality is not an inert stage. It is a participatory tapestry. The universe does not passively tolerate us. It needs us to collapse its infinite web of mathematical probabilities into something tangible. The silent war against the Stasis Syndicate and the blind architects would not be recorded in history books, but in the topological scar of the city itself. Vesperia was now a conscious ecosystem. Silas Vance, Arthur Penhaligon, and the growing network of generators now formed the immune system of the third dimension. They did not patrol the streets with weapons, but with the overwhelming gravitational density of their own humanity. They had learned that pain, irrational joy, and the entropy of love were the fundamental forces. They were the forces that kept the fourth dimension's quantum winter at bay. Immanuel Valerius had glimpsed the geometry of the invisible in the 19th century and went mad believing humans were mere two-dimensional shadows. Dr. Elena Rostova mastered it a century later and became a tyrant, convinced our entropy was a defect. She believed our biological entropy was a flaw to be purged through mathematical ascension. But Elias had found the definitive synthesis. Imperfection is the absolute engine of existence. The pleroma, with its immutable hypercubes and static time, was not heaven. It was a cemetery of absolute perfection. It was a cold, dead place. The true anomaly of the multiverse, the thermodynamic miracle that terrified n-dimensional entities, was human consciousness. The act of observing with intent does not just measure the universe, it forces it to take a shape. On his blackboard, Elias had erased the complex hyperspatial stress tensors of his previous work. In their place, he had written a symbolic formulation inspired by John Wheeler's participatory anthropic principle. In it, the conscious observation operator, tatan mathkul ris extunnos, acts on the inert superposition of the multiverse, milapsi, ext angle dhamma, forcing it to collapse. Ahat mathkal, ext apisai, ext angle eit arrow, ext angle. It was the most beautiful equation he had ever conceived, because it did not guarantee survival, peace, or eternity. It only guaranteed the friction necessary to experience life. Elias approached the window. Outside, Vesperia seethed. Car horns, steam from sewers, rain falling in chaotic gusts driven by unpredictable wind. Nothing in that scene obeyed perfect symmetry. Everything was wear, noise, and chaos. He smiled, feeling the earthly pulse of his scarred shoulder. On the other side of right angles, in the invisible darkness, the perfect entities would keep lurking. But as long as one observer embraced disorder, the universe would remain ours.